Elizabeth Whitmore did not cry at her sister's wedding. She had used up every tear she owned long before the church bells rang. She sat at the corner table with her hands folded in her lap, watching Caroline laugh, watching Caroline dance, watching Caroline become everything their mother had always said one of them would be. Nobody came to Elizabeth's table. Nobody asked. Nobody even looked. She had learned by 24 that being overlooked was not a wound. It was simply the weather. It was simply her life. If this story touched something in your heart, please subscribe to our channel and follow Elizabeth's journey all the way to the end. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The wedding had been Caroline's idea naturally. Everything good had always been Caroline's idea, or at least that was how their mother told it. Caroline had chosen the date the 14th of June, 1815, a Saturday, which their mother declared was the most romantic day of the week. Caroline had chosen the church in Charlottesville, the small white one on the hill, that caught the morning light and made every woman inside it look like she had been painted by God himself. Caroline had chosen the flowers, white roses and honeysuckle draped so thick over the altar that the smell of it reached Elizabeth before she even stepped through the door. Elizabeth had chosen nothing. She had been asked to wear the blue dress, the modest one with the high collar, because Caroline said it would look fine enough without drawing attention away from the bride. Elizabeth had put it on without argument. She had learned a long time ago that arguing with Caroline was like arguing with a river. You could stand in front of it all you liked, and the water would simply go around you. The church was full. The Whitmore family had money, and in Virginia in 1815 money meant guests, and guests meant performance. Half of Charlottesville had come along with families from Richmond, and one small important-looking delegation from a plantation north of the city that nobody named out loud, but everybody watched. Elizabeth sat in the second pew beside her mother, who spent the entire ceremony clutching a handkerchief to her face and weeping with a particular kind of joy that seemed designed to be visible from a distance. Elizabeth did not weep. She watched. She watched Caroline walk down the aisle on their father's arm, her white dress catching the light like something out of a fever dream. She watched Thomas Aldridge, 28, broad-shouldered and the third son of a tobacco family with more land than patience, stand at the altar with his jaw tight and his eyes bright. She watched him look at Caroline, the way men had always looked at Caroline, like she was the answer to a question they had not known they were asking. Elizabeth folded her hands in her lap and kept her face still. She was good at keeping her face still. She had been practicing since she was 12 years old, the year it became clear that Caroline was the beautiful one, and that beauty in their household was a kind of power that nothing else could match. She was not bitter. She told herself this firmly, the way you tell yourself something you are not entirely sure is true. She was not bitter. She was simply tired. There was a difference. The ceremony lasted 40 minutes. The breakfast that followed in the garden of the Aldridge estate 3 miles from town lasted considerably longer. There were tables spread across the lawn, white linen, catching the June heat, and somewhere a fiddle player had set up near the oak trees and was working through a reel with more enthusiasm than skill. The women gathered in clusters, fanning themselves and trading observations about the bride's dress. The men stood near the drinks and talked about tobacco prices and the new federal road that was supposed to run down through Kentucky. Elizabeth found a chair at the far end of the garden under a dogwood tree that gave just enough shade to make the heat bearable. She had a glass of lemonade she was not drinking, and a plate of food she was not eating, and she watched the party with the particular detachment of someone who has attended enough celebrations to understand that joy for most people is a performance as much as it is a feeling. Her mother found her within 20 minutes. Margaret Whitmore was a small woman with a large presence, the kind of person who could fill a room simply by deciding to be disappointed in it. She arrived at Elizabeth's chair with the expression she reserved for situations she found professionally embarrassing. "Lizzie," she said, "you are sitting alone." "I am aware of that, Mama." "It looks peculiar." "Does it? Come and sit with the Hartwell girls. Helen Hartwell is your age and she is perfectly pleasant." Helen Hartwell spent the last time I saw her explaining to a table of women that needlework is a moral failing. I would rather sit here. Her mother pressed her lips together. You are being difficult. I am being quiet. There is a difference. Margaret Whitmore looked at her eldest daughter for a long moment, and in that moment, Elizabeth saw, as she had seen 100 times before, the small private grief that her mother carried, and would never speak aloud, the grief of having produced one daughter who was extraordinary, and one who was merely fine. It was not cruelty. Her mother loved her in the way that people love things that disappoint them with a loyalty that costs something. Your sister is happy today, her mother said finally. I know she is. I am glad for her. Are you? Elizabeth looked up at her. Yes, Mama. I truly am. And she meant it. That was the thing nobody seemed to understand. She could love Caroline and also feel the particular loneliness of being Caroline's sister. The two things were not contradictions. They lived in her chest together side by side the way cold and warmth can exist in the same room if the windows are open. Her mother left. The fiddle player finished his reel and started another. The heat pressed down on everything thick and golden, the way Virginia summer always felt like the air itself was too heavy to move through without effort. Elizabeth sipped her lemonade and watched Caroline dance. She was beautiful, her sister. There was no use pretending otherwise, no dignified way to look at Caroline Whitmore. Caroline Aldridge now, she supposed, and not feel the simple fact of it. She had golden hair and bright eyes and a laugh that carried across gardens without effort. The kind of laugh that made people look over and smile without knowing why. She moved through the party like water, easy and natural, and Thomas Aldridge watched her with an expression so unguarded it was almost embarrassing to observe. Elizabeth turned away. She looked at the tree above her, at the way the leaves moved in the small, insufficient breeze. She was 24 years old. She was not old. She knew she was not old. And yet, sitting here at the corner of her sister's wedding, she felt something that had no good name. A kind of quiet conviction that this was what her life was going to continue to be. That she would keep sitting in corners watching, and that the world would keep arranging itself around people like Caroline, and that she, Elizabeth, would be the furniture, present, unnoticed, useful perhaps in a modest way, but not chosen. Never quite chosen. She was so deep in this thought that she did not notice the man standing at the edge of the party until he was already watching her. He was not part of any group she could see. He stood alone near the far side of the garden, holding a glass he was not drinking from, and he was not watching Caroline dance or the other young women laughing near the roses. He was watching Elizabeth, directly, steadily, in a way that made her sit up slightly without meaning to. She looked away, looked back. He was still watching. He was tall. She noticed that first because he stood at an angle to the crowd that made his height obvious. The kind of man who took up space without trying to. Dark hair, dark coat. The kind of clothes that were clearly expensive without announcing themselves. His face was serious. Not unkind, but serious in the way of a man who had learned to keep his expressions under control. He was perhaps 30, perhaps a little older. She could not be sure from this distance. She looked away again and told herself firmly that she was imagining it. Men did not watch her at parties. Men watched Caroline, or they watched the young women near the refreshment table, or they watched the cards if anyone was playing. They did not, in Elizabeth's experience, stand at the edge of a garden and look at the woman sitting alone under the dogwood tree with the untouched plate of food. She looked back a third time. He was still there, still watching. And this time when her eyes met his, he did not look away. He simply held her gaze for one long, deliberate moment, and then he moved. He walked across the garden toward her, with the unhurried certainty of a man who had already made a decision and saw no reason to rush it. He did not stop to speak to anyone on his way. He did not detour toward the drinks, or the food, or any of the clusters of guests who called to him as he passed. And some of them did call to him, she noticed with the particular eagerness that indicated this was someone whose attention was worth having. He did not stop. He came straight to her. He stopped 2 feet in front of her chair, looked down at her with those serious dark eyes and said, "Miss Whitmore." Elizabeth stared at him. "You know my name." I made it my business to learn it." She blinked. "Why?" "Because I wish to speak with you, and I prefer to do that properly." He tilted his head slightly. "May I sit?" There was an empty chair beside her that nobody had sat in for the past hour. She looked at it, then back at him. "I suppose you may." He sat. Not close, there was a proper distance between them, perfectly appropriate, but close enough that she could see now the faint lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of a man who had spent years squinting into daylight, or into trouble, or possibly both. "You are Nathaniel Carter," she said. It was not a question. She had placed him the moment he crossed half the garden. She had been paying attention to this party even while pretending she was not, and she had heard his name mentioned more than once that afternoon, always in the same careful, almost wary tone that people used for men of significant consequence. "I am," he said. "You own the Grayfield estate, north of the city." "I do." "My father has done business with your father." "I know. Your father is a man I respect." He paused. "You are not going to ask me why I came to sit with you?" She looked at him steadily. "I assumed you would tell me when you were ready." Something shifted in his expression. Something small and quick there and gone before she could name it. He looked at her the way people rarely looked at her, with actual attention, the kind that meant he was not simply seeing a woman at a table, but was seeing her Elizabeth, whatever small specific thing she was. "Everyone in this room," he said, "is performing something. The bride is performing happiness. The groom is performing confidence. The guests are performing the right kind of delight. You are the only person here who is simply sitting." Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Perhaps I have nothing to perform." "Or perhaps," he said, "you are the only person here who finds performance exhausting." She looked at him. He looked at her. The fiddle player started a slow waltz somewhere behind them, and neither of them paid any attention to it. "Mr. Carter," she said at last, "why did you cross the entire garden to sit with a woman who has been sitting alone for an hour and whom nobody else has approached?" He was quiet for a moment. He turned the glass in his hands, not drinking from it. Then he said, "Because I have been to a great many parties, Miss Whitmore, and I have noticed something. The person everyone overlooks is almost always the most interesting person in the room." He paused. "And you have been sitting here for an hour reading every person at this party without appearing to read anyone. That is a considerable skill." Elizabeth felt heat rise in her face that had nothing to do with the June sun. "You cannot possibly know that." "I watched you for 20 minutes before I came over," he said simply. "Your eyes move differently than everyone else's." She was not sure what to say to that. She was not sure she had ever had someone describe observing her the way she observed other people. "Mr. Carter," she said finally, "I find I am uncertain what you want from this conversation." "Nothing," he said. "I want nothing from you, Miss Whitmore. I came to sit with you because I chose to. That is all." That was the moment she would think about it later. Turn it over in her mind the way you turn over a coin to see both sides. That was the moment something shifted. Not in a romantic sense, not yet, not anything she would have called feeling, but something. A small, quiet thing, like a door somewhere in the house of herself, opening a crack just enough to let the air in. She looked down at her untouched glass of lemonade. "The party will notice," she said. "You sitting here." "I imagine so." "They will talk." "They generally do." "It will be said that you are paying attention to the wrong sister." There was a silence. Then he said very quietly, "Who decided which sister was wrong?" Elizabeth did not answer. There was no answer that would not cost her something. They talked for an hour. She did not know how it happened, how an hour passed while the party moved around them and the fiddle played and the afternoon light tilted toward evening, and she forgot somewhere in the middle of it to be guarded. He did not flirt with her. That was the first thing she noticed, and kept noticing because she had experienced enough of what passed for men's attention to know that it usually came wrapped in something self-serving. A man who needed an introduction to her father. A man who was positioned correctly and needed a wife with good connections. A man who found her sharp tongue amusing enough to be entertained for 10 minutes before moving on to someone softer. Nathaniel Carter did none of that. He asked her questions and waited for the actual answers. He disagreed with her twice directly and without apology, and both times he listened to what she said back. She told him she had studied history, that she had read everything in her father's library, and then borrowed from anyone she could find with more books. He said his own library at Grayfield had been largely inherited, and that he found most inherited books were chosen more for how they looked on the shelf than for what they said inside. She asked what he read himself when he had time. He said he had very little time, which was the most honest answer she had heard from a man of his position in years, because men of his position usually performed busyness rather than admitting to it as a condition. She told him her father wanted her to marry well before she was 25. He asked what she wanted. She told him she was not sure that question was considered relevant to her situation. He looked at her when she said that looked at her with an expression that was not pity. She would have tolerated nothing less than walking away if it had been pity, but something more like recognition. Like he understood exactly what she meant, not as a concept, but as a lived experience. She asked him why he had never married. He was quiet for longer than was comfortable. Then he said, "I was engaged 7 years ago." "What happened?" "It ended." She waited. He said, "It was my decision to end it." "I see." "No," he said. "You don't. But that is all right." He looked at her directly. "The version of the story that is told in this county is not the true one. I have accepted that." "Why not correct it?" "Because correcting it would require telling the truth. And telling the truth would hurt someone who has done nothing wrong except love the wrong person." He paused. "I made a choice 7 years ago between my reputation and another person's dignity. I chose their dignity. I would choose it again." Elizabeth looked at him. She was a careful person, a thorough person, a person who examined things from every angle before she committed to a position. She looked at Nathaniel Carter sitting in a garden chair beside her with his untouched drink and his too serious face. And she thought about what it cost a man to say something like that to a woman he had known for an hour. "The county thinks poorly of you," she said. "They think I jilted a woman without cause." "Yes." "And you let them think it." "Yes." "That is either very noble," she said, "or very foolish." "Perhaps both," he said. "They are not mutually exclusive conditions." Something in her chest moved at that, a small, cautious shift, like a sleeping thing turning over without waking. The party began to wind down as the sun fell behind the tree line and the August heat softened to something almost bearable. Guests began to drift toward carriages. Caroline and Thomas Aldridge received the last of the congratulations near the house steps, and Elizabeth's mother came to find her daughter with an expression that was divided precisely in half between irritation and something she would never call curiosity. "Lizzie," her mother said, and her eyes moved from Elizabeth to Nathaniel Carter and back again. "Mr. Carter." He stood, which meant she had to acknowledge him fully, and he said her mother's name with a courtesy so practiced and genuine it was impossible to find fault with. "You have been keeping my daughter company," her mother said. It was neither a compliment nor an accusation. It was a woman calibrating a situation she had not expected and was not sure what to do with. "Miss Whitmore has been very gracious," he said. "I hope I have not monopolized her time." Her mother looked at Elizabeth. Elizabeth returned the look with an expression that revealed nothing. "We are preparing to leave," her mother said. "Of course." He turned to Elizabeth, and he looked at her with those serious eyes, and she felt the weight of it, the way she felt the weight of very few things. "Miss Whitmore, it was a great pleasure." "Mr. Carter," she said. "Likewise." He took her hand briefly, the courtesy bow that convention demanded nothing more, and then he was gone. Moving back across the garden, stopping this time to exchange a word with Thomas Aldridge, and then disappearing around the side of the house. Her mother said nothing until they were in the carriage and moving down the road with the Aldridge estate disappearing behind them. Caroline and Thomas had already left for Richmond for their wedding trip. It was only Elizabeth and her parents in the swaying carriage, the evening air coming through the window, carrying the smell of honeysuckle and dust. "Nathaniel Carter," her mother said finally. "Yes," said Elizabeth. "He sat with you for an hour." "He did. He is—" Her mother stopped, looked at her. "Lizzie, that man has a reputation." "I know. He ended an engagement 7 years ago, Clara Beaumont. The girl was devastated. Her family barely recovered socially." Elizabeth looked at the road outside the window. "I am aware of the story, Mama." "Then you understand why I'm concerned." "He spoke well," her father said from the corner of the carriage where he had been quiet. Robert Whitmore was a slow-speaking man who used his words carefully, which meant that when he said something, it was worth attending to. "He is his father's son. The Carters are decent people, whatever the county says about that business with the Beaumonts." Her mother turned to look at her husband. "Robert, I am merely saying what I observed," he said. "A man who is what they say he is does not sit for an hour in a garden talking to a woman he gains nothing from. He does not do it quietly either. Half the party saw him." Silence. Elizabeth kept looking at the road. She told herself, reading anything into an afternoon's conversation. She was not a woman who allowed herself to read things into afternoons. She was a practical person, a grounded person, a person who had long since made her peace with the shape of her life, and was not going to allow an unexpected hour of genuine conversation to unbalance that peace. She was absolutely not going to think about the way he had said, "Who decided which sister was wrong?" She was not going to think about that at all. She thought about it all the way home. Cug. 3 days later, a letter arrived at the Whitmore house addressed to her father. Robert Whitmore read it at the breakfast table and said nothing for a long time. Then he set it down, looked up at his wife and said, "Nathaniel Carter has asked if he may call." Her mother put down her teacup. "Call here." "Here. On the family." He paused. He was specific about wishing to see Elizabeth. The silence at the breakfast table was of the particular variety that contains many things people are choosing not to say. Elizabeth kept eating her toast. She kept her face still. She had had 3 days to prepare for something she had told herself was not going to happen, and she found that preparation did not in fact reduce the quality of surprise when the thing happened anyway. "He wishes to see Elizabeth," her mother repeated. "That is what the letter says." Another silence. Then her mother looked at Elizabeth, and Elizabeth looked back at her, and her mother said very carefully, "What did you say to him at the wedding?" "I spoke honestly," Elizabeth said. "I said what I thought." "And what did you think?" Elizabeth considered this. That he was a man who had more to him than the story being told about him. Her mother was quiet for a moment longer. Then she said, "He has a complicated reputation, Lizzie." "I know. He is not easy as a prospect. The Beaumont business alone." "He explained the Beaumont business," Elizabeth said. She said it quietly, without emphasis, without drama. Both her parents looked at her. "He told you," her father said. "Something of it. Enough." She set down her toast. "I am not saying I have formed any conclusion, Papa. I am saying that there is more to the story than is generally known, and that I would like if you are willing for him to call." Her father looked at the letter. He looked at his daughter. He looked at his wife. Then he said, "I'll write back this afternoon." Nathaniel Carter arrived at the Whitmore house on a Wednesday morning 2 days after the letter at 10 o'clock, with the sun already strong and the Virginia heat building toward its midday peak. He arrived on horseback, which her mother found irregular, and dismounted at the front gate with the ease of a man who had been getting on and off horses since before he could properly walk. Elizabeth watched him from the parlor window. She had not meant to watch. She had been in the parlor reading, genuinely reading, and she had simply happened to hear the sound of a horse at the gate. He looked different in daylight. She searched for the word and settled on real. At the wedding, he had been a figure at the edge of a party, someone unexpected in a context that softened everything. Here, standing at the gate of her family's house in the clear morning light, he looked simply like a man. Serious, a little worn around the edges, carrying his height, with the slight awkwardness of someone who had always been too tall to be invisible. Her mother intercepted him in the hall. Elizabeth heard the exchange of courtesies. She could not make out the specific words, but she could hear the register. The formal warmth of two people observing the proprieties, and then her mother appeared in the parlor doorway. "He is here," she said unnecessarily. "I know, Mama." "He brought nothing." Elizabeth looked at her. "I beg your pardon. No flowers, no gift, nothing." Elizabeth set down her book. "He came to call on us not to court the parlor." Her mother pressed her lips together. "He is unusual." "Yes," Elizabeth agreed. "I believe that is the point." She stood up, smoothed her dress. Not the blue one this time she had chosen. The green one, the one that was not designed to render her invisible, and walked into the hall. He was standing near the door. He turned when she came in and looked at her the same way he had looked at her in the garden, that direct, unperforming attention that she had not been able to stop thinking about for 3 days. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Carter," she said. "You found us without difficulty." "Your father's directions were clear." A pause. "You look well?" "You look like a man who rode 2 hours in June heat without stopping," she said. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, not yet, but the suggestion that one might be possible. "I have a habit of doing things without stopping," he said. "I have been told it is a flaw." "Only by people who prefer hesitation," she said. "Come inside. My mother has arranged tea." The visit lasted 2 hours. Her father sat with them for the first 40 minutes, which was proper, and then excused himself to attend to business with the transparency of a man who had decided to manufacture privacy without drawing attention to it. Her mother lasted another 20 minutes before she remembered something urgent in another part of the house. They sat across from each other in the parlor, and nobody performed anything. He told her about Grayfield. She asked questions that were not the questions young women generally asked men about their estates. She did not ask about the acreage or the house's rooms, or whether it had a formal garden. She asked about the tenant farmers, how many, what their arrangements were, whether the shift in the tobacco market over the past decade had affected the way the land was worked. He looked at her with the expression she was starting to recognize, that slight surprised attention, and answered her directly. She learned that he had inherited Grayfield at 22, when his father died unexpectedly, and that he had spent the intervening 10 years learning how to run it, which meant he had spent 10 years learning through failure as much as through success. He said this without apology. She found she respected that. She told him about her reading about the history she had cobbled together from borrowed books, and her father's library, about the particular interest she had developed in law and property. Not fashionable subjects for a woman, she acknowledged, but she had long since stopped making her interests fashionable. "Why law?" he asked. "Because land and property are how everything gets decided," she said. "Who inherits what? Who owes what to whom? The whole machinery of society runs on those questions, and most women are never taught to understand any of it, which means that most women can be taken advantage of quite easily by anyone who does understand it." He looked at her for a moment. "You have thought about this carefully." "I have thought about a great many things carefully," she said. "I have had considerable time to think. Nobody has been demanding my company." It came out more raw than she intended. She felt the air in the room shift very slightly and looked away from him toward the window. He said quietly, "Their loss, Miss Whitmore." She looked back at him. "You cannot know that." "I can make an informed estimate," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Mr. Carter, I will not pretend I don't know what this looks like, you calling here in this manner. It looks like intention." "It is intention." The directness of it stopped her. "You have known me for 1 afternoon and a conversation," she said. "I have known you for 1 afternoon and a conversation," he agreed. "I am not proposing anything, Miss Whitmore. I am calling in the appropriate manner with your father's knowledge and your mother's presence. I am asking for the opportunity to know you better. That is all." He paused. "I am aware of how this appears. I am aware that people will say things about it. I have some experience with people saying things. The Beaumont story, she said. Among others. She was quiet for a moment. You said at the wedding that telling the truth would hurt someone. Are you still bound by that? He considered her. What are you asking? I am asking, she said, whether the story you carry about yourself is one you can share with me. Eventually. Not now. Eventually. She paused. Because if there is to be any, I do not want to be kept in the position of defending a man I do not fully understand. The silence stretched. Outside, a cardinal called from somewhere in the garden 3 sharp notes and was still. Yes, Nathaniel Carter said. Eventually, I can share it. She nodded once. Then I believe we can proceed. What followed was 6 weeks. 6 weeks of calls every Wednesday and occasionally Friday when the weather was good enough to ride. 6 weeks of parlor conversations that her mother chaperoned with decreasing attentiveness as she became convinced there was nothing untoward occurring which was accurate, although accuracy and the whole truth were not always the same thing. The truth was that Elizabeth was falling. She was doing it slowly with full awareness the way a person climbs down a ladder rather than tumbles off one. She knew each step she was taking, she made each step deliberately, and she was still falling. She fell because of the way he listened. She had never met a man who listened the way Nathaniel Carter did, not politely waiting for his turn, but actually listened, took in what she said, and thought about it, and came back to it later. Sometimes much later. Sometimes in the middle of an entirely different conversation. She would say something on a Wednesday, and he would reference it the following Friday, having clearly spent the days between thinking about it. She fell because of his silences. He was not a man who filled silence nervously, and neither was she, and they discovered early that they could sit together in quiet without either of them feeling compelled to disrupt it. This seemed like a small thing. It was not a small thing. She fell because of a specific afternoon in the middle of July when she was sitting in the parlor and her mother said something about Caroline's new house in Richmond and about how beautifully Caroline had settled in, and Elizabeth's expression did not change, but something in her must have shifted because Nathaniel said quietly when her mother had left the room, "You are allowed to find it hard." She looked at him. Find what hard? Loving someone and also carrying the weight of standing next to them your whole life. He held her gaze. It is not disloyalty. It is simply the truth of the position you've been in. Nobody had ever said that to her. Not once, not in 24 years. She looked away from him quickly out the window at the July light on the garden. She held herself very still until she was sure her face was under control. Then she looked back. You see too much, Mr. Carter, she said. Probably, he said. I apologize. Don't, she said quietly. Don't apologize. He didn't. It was her father who told her on a Tuesday evening at the end of July that Nathaniel had asked to speak with him privately. She was in the sitting room after supper when her father came in and sat in the chair across from hers and looked at her with the expression he had when he was about to say something he had been thinking about for a while. Mr. Carter came by the counting house this afternoon, he said. Elizabeth set down her sewing. She did not do anything else. She waited. He asked me for permission to address you formally. Her father paused. He was very clear that he was asking for permission to speak to you, not for permission to have you. He made a specific point of the distinction. The sitting room was quiet. Somewhere in the house a clock ticked. What did you tell him? Elizabeth asked. I told him that was the matter he needed to take up with you. Her father looked at her. Lizzie, he is a man I have come to respect over these past weeks. What he did with the Beaumont situation, I know more of it than your mother thinks I do, and I believe his character is sound. He paused. But he is not simple. His life is not simple. And you are my daughter, and I will not push you toward anything. Elizabeth looked at her hands. She looked at the sewing in her lap. She looked at the window where the evening light was going gold and soft above the trees. I know, she said. I know he is not simple. And she looked at her father. and I have never once in my life been interested in simple." Her father was quiet for a moment. Then something moved across his face, something she could not quite name, some private combination of sorrow and pride, and he nodded. "He will come tomorrow," he said, "in the morning." She nodded. "I'll be here." He came at 9 o'clock before the heat had built. The house was quiet. Her mother had arranged to be in the garden with pointed deliberateness, and her father was in his study. Nathaniel Carter stood in the parlor and looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. There was a particular quality to the silence, weighted aware the silence of two careful people standing at the edge of something they both knew was significant. "I imagine my father told you the nature of my visit," he said. "He told me you wished to address me formally," she said. "He is accurate." He was still for a moment, and she saw something she had not quite seen before. Not in 6 weeks of Wednesdays and Fridays, she saw that he was uncertain. Not anxious, not afraid, but genuinely uncertain the way a man is uncertain, when the outcome matters enough to remove the ordinary comfort of confidence. She found to her own surprise that it moved her more than anything else he had ever shown her. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Elizabeth." It was the first time he had used her given name. She felt it settle somewhere in her chest. "I will not tell you that I came to this unexpectedly," he said. "That would not be true. I came to your sister's wedding because I knew your family would be there, and I had heard your name mentioned, and I thought I might speak with you. What I did not expect was—" He paused, looked at the floor briefly, then back at her. "I did not expect to find in you someone who made me want to be less careful." She looked at him steadily. "What do you mean?" "I have been very careful for 10 years, he said. "Careful about what I said, careful about who I trusted, careful about what I showed of myself. It was—" He stopped, looked for the word. "Necessary. After everything with the Beaumonts, it was necessary." He paused. "With you, I find that the carefulness is exhausting in a way it has not been before. Because with you, I keep wanting to simply be honest, entirely honest, without calculating the cost of it first." She understood what he was telling her. She understood it completely. "That is—" She stopped herself, breathed. "That is not nothing, Mr. Carter." "No," he said. "It is not." He met her eyes. "I am asking for the opportunity to tell you the truth. All of it. The Beaumont story and the rest of it. The things that are difficult, and the things that are unflattering, and the things I would rather nobody ever knew about the worst year of my life." He paused. "I am asking because I cannot ask you to consider me without you knowing what you are actually considering." She was very still. "And then," he said, "when you have heard it, I am asking if you would be willing to allow me to court you properly, with full knowledge of what I am." The morning light came through the parlor windows and fell between them warm and clear, the particular light of a Virginia summer morning that seemed to make everything slightly more real than it ordinarily was. Elizabeth looked at Nathaniel Carter. She looked at the man who had crossed a garden to sit with her when nobody else did. The man who had listened. The man who had said, who decided which sister was wrong. The man who had told her without being asked, without being prodded, that she was allowed to find things hard. She said, "Tell me the truth then." He told her. He spoke for a long time. She did not interrupt. What he told her was not in its structure entirely different from what she had already understood in outline. 7 years ago, when he was 25, he had been engaged to Clara Beaumont of Richmond. It had been a family arrangement suitable on both sides, and he had been not in love exactly, but willing, which had seemed sufficient at the time. The wedding had been planned for the following spring. 4 months before the wedding, he had discovered that Clara was in love with another man. Not suspicion, not rumor. He had learned it in the most direct way possible by finding a letter she had written that she did not know he had seen. A letter that made it perfectly clear that she was marrying Nathaniel because her family required it of her and because she saw no way out, and that the man she truly loved was someone her family would never accept, a man of lower position. No land, no money, no name to offer. He had made a decision in 24 hours. He had gone to Clara privately. He had told her what he knew. She had been, he said, more frightened than he had ever seen a person be frightened of what would happen to her family's opinion of her, frightened of what the truth would cost her mother, who had made this match with such pride, frightened of losing her reputation in the only society she had ever known. He had told her that the engagement was his to end, that he would end it, that the reason given publicly would be his own insufficiency, something about incompatibility, something that put the failure on his side and left her with nothing to be blamed for. She had wept. She had asked him why. He had told her that nobody should be required to marry without love if there was any way to avoid it, and that there was a way, and he was in a position to take it, and that was enough. He had ended the engagement. The story that spread was the one he had allowed to spread, that he had been cold, that he had broken the engagement without adequate explanation, that Clara Beaumont had been deeply hurt. He had not corrected a word of it. Clara had married her other man, the man she loved, within the year. They had moved to Georgia. He had heard indirectly that they were happy. He had spent 7 years being the man who had jilted Clara Beaumont. When he finished, Elizabeth was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You told no one?" "No. Not a single person." "No." "Why are you telling me?" He looked at her. "Because I asked to court you, and I will not do that on a foundation of things you don't know." She looked at the window. She looked at her hands. She looked at him. "Nathaniel," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name. She saw it register. "What you did was—" She searched. "It was right. It was right, and it cost you, and you did it anyway, and you have never let anyone know it was right." She paused. "That is—" She stopped. "It is perhaps overly noble," he said. There was something wry in his voice, now very small, like a door opening an inch. "I have been told that too." "It is not overly noble," she said quietly. "It is simply decent. And decent things should not have to cost this much." She paused. "I am sorry it cost you this much." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face changed, not dramatically, not in any way that the room would have noticed, but she noticed. Something in the set of his expression that had been held in place for a very long time released just slightly. "You are—" He stopped, began again. "You are not what I expected, Elizabeth." "No," she said. "I imagine I'm not." She met his eyes. "Court me properly, Nathaniel Carter. I would like that." He looked at her. He nodded once. Outside the parlor window, the Virginia summer was already building toward noon, and somewhere in the garden, Elizabeth's mother was absolutely not listening, and the light lay across the floor between them, like something that had been waiting patiently for quite some time. The courtship of Elizabeth Whitmore and Nathaniel Carter was not a quiet thing, no matter how quietly it began. Word moved fast in Charlottesville in the summer of 1815. It always had. A county where everyone knew everyone else's business before they knew their own was not a county that allowed a man like Nathaniel Carter to call on a woman like Elizabeth Whitmore for 6 consecutive Wednesdays without drawing the kind of attention that came with opinions attached. By the 3rd week, Elizabeth's mother was receiving callers in the afternoon who stayed for tea and left having said nothing directly, but everything indirectly. By the 4th week, Elizabeth herself began to notice the way women at church looked at her, not with hostility exactly, but with the particular sharpened curiosity of people who have decided something interesting is happening and intend to have a view on it. Caroline wrote from Richmond. The letter arrived on a Thursday and was short, which meant Caroline was being careful, which meant she had already heard things. Dearest Lizzie, I understand Mr. Carter has been calling. I hope you are being sensible. He is a complicated man, and I would not want you to be hurt. Write and tell me everything. Your loving sister C. Elizabeth read the letter twice and wrote back. Dearest Caroline, I am always sensible. I hope Richmond suits you. Your sister E. She did not write and tell her everything. She was not sure she could have found the words for it, even if she had wanted to. What was happening between her and Nathaniel was not the kind of thing that translated easily into the language of letters, which required you to describe events and sentiments in a way that made them orderly and containable. What was happening was neither orderly nor containable. It was something she was still in the middle of and could not yet see the shape of from the outside. What she could see from the inside was this: she had spent her entire adult life feeling like a person standing at the edge of a room that everyone else was inside of, watching through glass. And now, for the first time she could remember, someone had opened a door. She was not naive enough to think that opening a door was the same thing as walking through it. She was not naive about anything, which was both her greatest asset and the thing that made joy when it came complicated to hold. But she was holding it, carefully, with both hands. The 5th Wednesday of August brought trouble before it brought Nathaniel. He arrived at 10 in the morning, as was his custom, and Elizabeth met him in the hall, as was her custom, and they were moving toward the parlor when her mother appeared from the direction of the sitting room with an expression that Elizabeth had learned over 24 years to interpret precisely. It was the expression her mother wore when something had happened that she considered socially dangerous and was not yet sure how to manage. "Mr. Carter," her mother said. "Good morning." "Mrs. Whitmore." He inclined his head. "You look as though something concerns you." That stopped her mother. She had not expected directness. Most people did not expect directness from Nathaniel Carter. Elizabeth had noticed, because his face was so controlled that people tended to assume his manner would be equally guarded. They were wrong. When he decided to be direct, he was extremely direct. "I received a call yesterday afternoon," her mother said, "from Mrs. Henry Beaumont." The air in the hall changed. Elizabeth felt it. Nathaniel's expression did not change, not visibly, but she was watching him carefully now, and she saw something move through his eyes, a recognition, a bracing, a thing that had been expected for some time and had finally arrived. "I see," he said. "She came with her daughter Margaret," her mother continued. "Margaret Beaumont, who is Clara's younger sister. They stayed for an hour." She looked at Nathaniel directly. "Mrs. Beaumont had a great deal to say about you, Mr. Carter." "I imagine she did," he said. "She said things that I found—" Her mother paused, searching for the precise word she wanted. "Troubling." "Mama," Elizabeth said. "Elizabeth, let me finish." Her mother folded her hands in front of her. "Mrs. Beaumont told me that you destroyed her family's standing in this county 7 years ago, that you made Clara Beaumont a figure of pity through your coldness, and she used the word cruelty, that you are not a man of good character, and that any woman who allows herself to be courted by you is making a grave mistake." The hall was very still. Nathaniel stood without moving. His hands were at his sides. His face was— She looked at him and saw what was in his face. And it was not shame exactly, and it was not anger. It was something closer to the expression of a man who has carried a weight so long he no longer notices its exact shape, only its presence. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "I will not insult you by denying that the Beaumont family has cause for feeling as they do. What they believe about me is what they believe, and it is consistent with the information they have been given. I can only tell you that the information they have is not complete." "Then give me the complete information," her mother said. "If you wish to continue calling on my daughter Mr. Carter, I need to understand what I am allowing into this house." Elizabeth said, "Mama, he has already told me." Her mother turned to look at her. "He has told you?" "Yes." "And you believe him?" Elizabeth met her mother's eyes steadily. "I do." A silence, the kind of silence that contains a renegotiation. Her mother looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel looked at her mother. Then her mother looked at Elizabeth for a long time. The way she looked at things, she was truly trying to see, rather than simply observe, and Elizabeth held still and let her look. "Will you tell me," her mother said to Nathaniel, "what you told my daughter?" "If you wish to hear it," he said yes. They went into the sitting room, not the parlor. The sitting room was her mother's room, the one she controlled, and Elizabeth understood the choice her mother was placing this conversation on her own ground. Nathaniel sat in the chair across from her mother and told the same story he had told Elizabeth, with the same absence of self-justification, the same directness. He did not ask to be believed. He simply told her what had happened. Her mother listened without interrupting. That alone told Elizabeth something. Her mother interrupted conversations frequently, efficiently, and without apology. She did not interrupt this one. When he finished, there was a long quiet. Her mother looked at her hands. She looked at the window. She looked at Nathaniel. "You let a family believe the worst of you," she said finally. "For 7 years. To protect a girl who married someone else. Yes. And you want me to trust you with my daughter. I want you to hear the truth and make your own determination," he said. "I am not asking for trust that has not been earned. I am asking for the opportunity to earn it." Her mother was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "Clara Beaumont is happy." "Yes, I believe so." "You know this." "I made certain to know," he said simply. Her mother looked at him for a long time. "Margaret Beaumont will not stop," she said. She was very clear about her intentions. "She means to warn every family in this county." "I know." "That will make things difficult for Elizabeth." "I know that too," he said. "And if you tell me that the difficulty is not worth it to you, I will accept that judgment and I will not return." Elizabeth felt her breath catch. She held it. Her mother turned to look at her. Elizabeth looked back. They looked at each other across the room, across the years, across everything that had passed between them that was unspoken and perhaps always would be. Her mother said, "Elizabeth, what do you want?" It was. Elizabeth thought possibly the first time in her life her mother had asked her that question and actually waited for the answer. She said, "I want him to keep calling." Her mother turned back to Nathaniel. "Then keep calling Mr. Carter," she said. "But understand that I will be watching." "I would expect nothing less," he said. Margaret Beaumont moved fast. She had the particular efficiency of a woman who had been holding on to a grievance for years and had finally been given a suitable occasion to act on it. Within the week, Elizabeth's mother was told by 3 separate people, the wives of a merchant, a doctor, and a county magistrate, that there were serious questions being raised about Nathaniel Carter's character, and that perhaps Mrs. Whitmore ought to consider whether she was doing her daughter a service by encouraging the connection. Elizabeth heard most of this secondhand because her mother came to her each evening and reported it with the precision of a military dispatch, and because by the end of the second week she was also hearing it directly at church. At a sewing circle she attended out of obligation from a cousin of Caroline's husband, who had no particular reason to say anything about it, except that she clearly found the situation entertaining. She handled it the way she handled most things. She said very little and thought a great deal. What she thought primarily was that she was not surprised. She had known from the beginning that Nathaniel came with a complicated inheritance, that the Beaumont story followed him the way shadows follow people in strong light, and she had gone into this, whatever this was, with open eyes. She had not deceived herself about the cost. What she had not fully anticipated was the loneliness of it. Not the external pressure she could manage external pressure. What she had not anticipated was the particular quality of loneliness that came from caring about someone who carried something he could not fully defend himself against, and watching him carry it, and knowing the truth and being unable to say it, because saying it was his choice to make, and not hers. She said none of this to Nathaniel directly. She said it only to herself in the evenings when the house was quiet. He came on Wednesday and said without preamble, when they were seated in the parlor with her mother, a tactful distance away, "You have been hearing things." "Yes," she said. "Are you all right?" She looked at him. "I am fine." "Elizabeth." "I said I am fine, Nathaniel." "You said it the way people say they are fine when they mean something more complicated than fine." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I am managing." "Managing is not the same as fine." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." She looked at her hands briefly. I did not expect it to feel quite this. She stopped, looked for the right word. Exposed. I did not expect to feel quite this exposed. He was quiet for a moment. If you want to step back from... I don't, she said quickly and completely. He stopped. She said more quietly, I don't want to step back. I simply want you to know that it costs something, so you know. She paused. And so you know I consider it worth the cost. I want you to know both things. He looked at her for a long time. His face did something complex and brief, and then settled back into its usual careful arrangement, except that the arrangement looked slightly different now from how it had looked when she first met him. And she thought she was perhaps one of the only people in the county who would have noticed that difference, or been able to name what it was. What it was, she thought, was the expression of a man who was not used to being given things freely. You are. He stopped. Began again. I have been alone in this for a long time, he said. I had forgotten what it was like to have someone... He stopped again. He pressed his lips together. He looked at the window. Then he looked back at her and said without finishing the sentence, Thank you. She said simply, Don't thank me yet. Wait and see what I'm worth first. I already know what you're worth, he said. She looked at him. You are alarmingly confident for a man who has known me less than 2 months. Some things are apparent, he said, almost immediately. She felt the thing in her chest again, that warm, dangerous, careful thing. She looked away first. She was not yet ready to look at it directly. The magistrate's wife was named Mrs. Eldora Crofton, and she was a woman of approximately 60, whose primary occupation, as best Elizabeth could determine, was the organization of other people's business into categories of appropriate and inappropriate, a task she performed with relentless competence. She arrived at the Whitmore house on a Tuesday afternoon, without prior notice, which was itself a statement, and her mother let her in because there was no graceful way not to. Elizabeth was in the sitting room when she heard her mother's voice in the hall, and then Mrs. Crofton's voice, which carried the way the voices of women who expect to be listened to always carry. She stayed in her chair. She kept her sewing in her hands. She kept her face still. Her mother brought Mrs. Crofton in. Mrs. Crofton was a tall woman with gray hair and the carriage of someone who had spent decades operating from a position of social authority. She sat in the chair across from Elizabeth without being invited to sit, which was also a statement. Miss Whitmore, she said, I thought it prudent to speak with you directly. Mrs. Crofton, Elizabeth said. What a pleasant surprise. The pleasantness in her voice was absolutely not a surprise to either of them. I will be brief, Mrs. Crofton said. I understand that Nathaniel Carter has been calling here. He has, Elizabeth said. I understand the nature of his calls. Good, Elizabeth said. Then I need not explain them. Mrs. Crofton looked at her with an expression that indicated she was adjusting her approach. Miss Whitmore, I speak to you as a woman who has been a part of this county for 40 years and who has your family's interests at heart. Nathaniel Carter is not a man whose attention is to a young woman's benefit, whatever he has told you about the Beaumont situation. Mrs. Crofton, Elizabeth said. Her voice was very even. I thank you for your concern. It speaks well of you that you take an interest in the welfare of young women in this county. She paused. But I am 24 years old. I am not without intelligence or judgment, and I have found in my experience that the people most eager to warn a woman away from a particular man are usually the people who know the least about what that man is actually like. Mrs. Crofton blinked. I am not dismissing your concern, Elizabeth continued. I am simply telling you that I have thought very carefully about my situation and that I am not in need of additional thinking done on my behalf. She looked at her directly. I appreciate your visit. There was a silence. Then Mrs. Crofton said slowly, You are a great deal more decided than I had expected. Yes, Elizabeth said. I generally am. Mrs. Crofton left 20 minutes later. Elizabeth's mother came back into the sitting room and sat down across from her and looked at her daughter with an expression Elizabeth could not immediately categorize. "Lizzie," she said. "Mama." That was... Her mother paused. "That was something." "I was perfectly polite," Elizabeth said. "You were perfectly polite," her mother agreed, in a way that made perfectly polite sound like the beginning of something considerably less polite. She studied her daughter. "You are more like your father than I have generally admitted." Elizabeth considered that. "I will take that as a compliment." "It was intended as one," her mother said. Then after a moment, "Eldora Crofton has a mouth the size of this county. She will tell everyone she spoke to you." "I know," Elizabeth said. "It will be reported differently than it occurred." "Probably," Elizabeth said. "But I have found that what is reported about a person and what is true about a person are generally two different things. I have been learning that lesson from an interesting teacher." Her mother looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "He is going to ask you to marry him, Elizabeth." The directness of it stopped her. "Perhaps," she said carefully. "Not perhaps. I have watched men carefully for a great many years, and I know what they look like when they have made a decision. That man has made a decision." Her mother paused. "What I want to know is whether you have made yours." Elizabeth looked at her mother. The afternoon light was long and warm in the sitting room, coming at the angle that meant it was past 4 o'clock, and the day was starting to close. Outside, she could hear a horse on the road, and somewhere farther off, the first of the evening birds beginning. "I think," she said carefully, "that if he asks, I will say yes." Her mother breathed in, let it out. "In spite of everything." "Not in spite of everything," Elizabeth said. "Because of everything." She paused. "All of it. The Beaumont story. The reputation. The difficult years. All of that tells me exactly who he is, Mama. More clearly than any amount of good behavior in easy circumstances." She looked at her hands. "He chose someone else's dignity over his own name. He carried it for 7 years without complaint." She looked up. "I have spent my entire life being overlooked. If I am going to give my life to someone, I would like it to be someone who understands what it costs to carry something in silence. Because I believe he is one of the only people I have ever met who actually does." Her mother was quiet for a very long time. Then, unexpectedly, her mother said, "He sees you." "Yes," Elizabeth said. "He does." Her mother reached out briefly and pressed her hand over Elizabeth's. It was not a gesture her mother made often. It was not a woman given to easy gestures of that kind. It meant something because it was rare. "Then God help you both," her mother said. "And I mean that in the most genuinely hopeful way." It was the following Wednesday, the first day of September, when Nathaniel arrived at the house with something different in his bearing. She noticed it the moment she saw him. Not anxiety, not nerves in the ordinary sense, but a quality of stillness that was different from his usual stillness, more deliberate. The stillness of a man who has decided something and is now in the process of doing it. She knew before he said a word what was happening. They went into the parlor. Her mother made her entrance and her exit within 15 minutes, the fastest she had ever managed it. And then they were alone in the room, with the September morning going gold outside the windows and the year starting its slow turn toward autumn. He did not sit. She did. He stood in front of the window and looked at her, and she looked at him, and the silence between them was the kind of silence that is not actually silent. It was full-weighted alive with everything that had been said over the past 2 months, and everything that had not yet been said. "Elizabeth," he said. "Nathaniel." He was quiet for a moment longer. Then he said, "I have spent 10 years being very careful about what I want. I found after the Beaumont situation that wanting things was complicated, dangerous. I had made a decision, and it had cost me in ways I did not fully anticipate, and I decided that the safest approach was to stop reaching for things I could not be certain of keeping." She said nothing. She watched him, and then he said, "I went to a wedding." And there was a woman sitting alone under a dogwood tree with an untouched glass of lemonade, reading an entire room of people without appearing to read anyone. And I made a decision in approximately 3 minutes that I have not regretted for a single day since. She felt the warmth move up through her chest. I am not a simple man, he said. My life is not a simple life. The next years are going to be, there are things at Grayfield that need attention, and the Beaumont situation is not resolved in the eyes of the county, and I cannot promise you easy. I cannot promise you that everyone will be kind, because I know for certain that some of them won't be. He paused. What I can promise you is that I will never lie to you. I can promise that what I feel for you is the most honest thing I have felt in 10 years, and that I will not misuse it or take it for granted. I can promise that you will never again sit in a corner of a room wondering whether anyone intends to cross it for you. He looked at her. Because I will always cross it, whatever it costs. Elizabeth sat very still. She had thought about this moment. She had thought about it the way she thought about everything carefully, from multiple angles, trying to see what it would actually feel like, rather than what she imagined it would feel like. She had imagined she would feel something large and dramatic, something commensurate with the size of what was being offered. What she felt instead was something very quiet. It was the feeling of a thing settling into its place. The feeling of something she had been bracing against for a long time. The bracing of a person who is not sure they will ever be wanted releasing slowly, like a fist unclenching. She said, "You have not actually asked me yet." He looked at her. Something crossed his face, the beginning of that rare thing, the almost smile. "No," he said. "I have not." "Then ask," she said. He said, "Elizabeth Ann Whitmore, will you marry me?" He did not say it as a question. He said it as a statement of intent, clear and certain, with the same directness he brought to everything, and she thought, yes, that is right. That is exactly right, because that is who he is. She said, "Yes, I will marry you, Nathaniel Carter." He crossed the room. He took her hands in his. His hands were warm and steady, and she felt holding them, that she was holding something real, something grounded, something that was not going anywhere. "You are certain," he said. "I want you to be certain." "I am 24 years old," she said. "I have spent 24 years thinking carefully about things before I committed to them. I am certain." He looked at her hands for a moment. Then he looked up at her. "You once told me that you were not sure the question of what you wanted was considered relevant to your situation." "I remember." "I want to be very clear," he said, "that I consider it the only relevant question." She felt something behind her eyes go warm and bright. She blinked once. She would not cry. She was not a person who cried easily, and she was not going to start now. "Nathaniel," she said. "Yes." "I believe my mother is standing just outside the parlor door." There was a pause. Then he said low and very dry, "How long do you estimate she has been there?" "Since approximately the moment I said yes," Elizabeth said, a beat. Then the door opened, and her mother came in with an expression that was composed of equal parts attempted dignity and completely failed composure, and she looked at Nathaniel and looked at Elizabeth and said, her voice unusually unsteady, "Your father will want to hear this from you directly, Lizzie." "I know, Mama. He is in his study." She pressed her lips together. "He has been in his study for an unusually long time for a man who does not generally spend this much time in his study." Elizabeth stood. She looked at Nathaniel, who was looking at her with that expression she had come to know over 2 months, and still could not entirely name that serious, direct, fully attending gaze that made her feel like the most visible person in the room. She said, "Come and speak with my father." He offered his arm. She took it. They walked out of the parlor and down the hall toward the study, and behind them her mother stood in the parlor and did something Elizabeth had not heard her do in a very long time. She laughed. Robert Whitmore's study was a room of books and old light of papers. He was always almost organizing, and a desk he used as a thinking surface more than a working one. He was standing when they entered, which meant he had heard them coming, which meant he had known this was coming. He looked at Nathaniel. He looked at his daughter on Nathaniel's arm with an expression on her face that he had perhaps never seen there before, that particular openness, that unguarded thing. Then he looked at Nathaniel again. "Mr. Carter," he said. "Sir," Nathaniel said, "I have asked your daughter to marry me. She has accepted. I am here to ask for your blessing." Her father was quiet for a moment. He looked at Elizabeth. She looked back at him, and she saw him see her. See her clearly in the way that fathers see their children when the children are no longer what they were, but have become what they are. He said, "Do you love him, Lizzie?" It was not the question she had expected. She had expected something practical, something about arrangements or the matter of the Beaumont reputation or the mechanics of what happened next. She had not expected that. She said, "Yes, Papa, I do." He nodded. He turned to Nathaniel. He said, "You will treat her with the respect she has earned and the attention she deserves." "Yes, sir," Nathaniel said. "I intend to." "She is not a decoration," her father said. "She is not a hostess. She is not a household manager. She is the most intelligent person in my family, and I say that including myself, and if you do not already know, that you will know it within the year." Nathaniel said without hesitation, "I already know it, sir." Her father looked at him for one more long moment. Then he extended his hand. Nathaniel took it. They shook once firmly, and the matter was settled, in the way that matters between men of that era were settled not with flourish, not with performance, but with the weight of a decision made and acknowledged. Her father turned to Elizabeth and crossed the room to her and put his hand briefly against her face, the way he had done when she was small, and she felt the years in that gesture, all the years of being overlooked and quiet and fine, and felt them shift, somehow rearrange themselves into something she had not previously understood them to be. "Good," her father said. "Good." They announced the engagement the following Sunday, in the way such announcements were made through the correct channels in the correct order. Her father informing the relevant families, the information reaching the community, with the inevitability of water finding its level. It spread fast because in Charlottesville, things always spread fast, and because the engagement of Nathaniel Carter to Elizabeth Whitmore was by any social measure surprising in ways that made it interesting. The reaction was divided. There were people who received it warmly, families who respected her father, older women who had always found Nathaniel more complex than his reputation men, who had done business with both Carters and Whitmores, and saw the match as sensible. There were people who received it coolly, those who had believed the Beaumont story completely, those who thought Elizabeth too plain, or too quiet, or too bookish for a man of Nathaniel's standing, those who simply disliked disruption to the social order they had already mapped. And then there was Margaret Beaumont. She wrote a letter to Elizabeth. It arrived on a Wednesday, 8 days after the announcement. Elizabeth's mother brought it to her in the parlor with an expression that said she had considered opening it herself and had decided reluctantly that she could not. Elizabeth opened it. The letter was long. It was in its way a careful document, not hysterical, not explicitly abusive, but devastating in the way that calm precision can be devastating. Margaret Beaumont laid out in clear and formal language everything her family believed about Nathaniel Carter, what he had done to Clara, what it had cost them, what the engagement to Elizabeth represented in her framing a pattern, a man who collected women's trust and discarded them when it suited him. She did not know the truth, Elizabeth reminded herself. Margaret Beaumont had never known the truth. She read the letter to the end. Then she folded it and held it in her hands for a moment and felt the weight of it. Not the weight of doubt, but the weight of understanding that the truth was not always available to the people who most needed it, and that this was a problem she was going to have to carry. She wrote back. She wrote carefully. She wrote to Margaret Beaumont and said, "I have heard your concern, and I respect that it comes from love for your sister. I ask only that you consider whether the story you have been told is the complete one. I understand if you cannot, but I ask it." She did not tell the truth in the letter. That was not her truth to tell. But she planted the question small and careful like a seed in difficult soil. She did not know if it would grow. She sent the letter and turned back to the preparations for a wedding and a life and everything that was waiting on the other side of the word yes. The wedding was set for November. Not a large wedding, Elizabeth had been clear about that, and Nathaniel had agreed without requiring persuasion, which was one of the many things she was learning to love about him. He did not require persuasion on the things that mattered to her. He simply heard her and adjusted the way a man adjusts who has decided that the other person's comfort is not a negotiation but a priority. Her mother had opinions about the size of the wedding that she expressed frequently and with feeling. Elizabeth listened to all of them and incorporated approximately a third, which her mother understood after a while was the best outcome she was going to get. The ceremony would be at the church in Charlottesville. The breakfast afterward at the Whitmore house. 40 guests, perhaps 50. Flowers from the garden. No elaborate procession. Caroline wrote again from Richmond, longer this time, with less caution and more genuine feeling in it. Lizzie, I am so very happy for you. I know I have not always. I know things between us have not always been come and see me before the wedding. Please. Your sister. Elizabeth wrote back and said she would try. She meant it. Whatever complicated thing lived between her and Caroline, it was not a thing she wanted to leave complicated forever. September moved into October, and October had its own quality. The heat finally breaking the leaves starting their turn on the Virginia hills, the air coming through the windows at night, cool enough to need a blanket. Elizabeth spent the days of October in a state she did not entirely have a name for. Not exactly happiness, though happiness was present. Something larger than happiness. Something that included fear and uncertainty, and the particular vulnerability of a woman who has opened herself to something enormous and is now living inside the reality of it. She visited Grayfield for the first time on a Friday in mid-October. Nathaniel rode beside their carriage the whole way, and she watched him from the window. This man she was going to marry, this serious and careful and unexpectedly gentle man. And she thought about what her father had said. He sees you. He did. He saw her clearly, without flattery, without the softening that other people applied to women they wanted to manage. He saw what she was and wanted it anyway, wanted it specifically, and she was still even now adjusting to the weight of that. Grayfield was larger than she had imagined. She had known the numbers, the acreage, the tenants, the scale of it, but numbers were different from presence, and the presence of the place was considerable. She stepped out of the carriage and stood in front of a house that was imposing without being cold, a house that had been lived in seriously by serious people and felt the full reality of what she was walking into. Nathaniel stood beside her. He said quietly, "You are very still." "I am thinking," she said. "What are you thinking?" She turned to look at him. "That this is a great deal of house for a man who has been living in it alone." Something moved across his face that almost smiled. "It has been somewhat echoey," he said. "I imagine so." She turned back to the house. "Show me the library." He laughed. It was the first time she had heard him actually laugh, and it was a good sound, surprised and real, not performed. She stored it away. He showed her the library first as requested, and she spent 45 minutes in it while he stood near the door and watched her pull books off shelves and examine them with the focused attention of a person doing an actual inventory. She found 2 books she had been trying to locate for years and held them with an expression that he later told her was the happiest he had seen her look at that point in their acquaintance, which she found both accurate and slightly mortifying. She found also on a low shelf near the window a leather-bound book with no title on the spine. She pulled it out. It was a journal. The handwriting inside was faded, the dates going back 30 years, and the name on the inside cover was William Carter, his father. She held it for a moment, then put it back carefully. "Your father kept a journal," she said. "He did. His whole life." Nathaniel crossed to her, then stood beside her and looked at the shelf. "I have never read them." She looked at him. "Why not?" "Because I am not ready," he said simply. And then after a moment, "Perhaps when there is someone in this house who would read them with me." She understood what he was saying. She felt the weight of it, the trust of it, the particular intimacy of a man who was saving something for the person he intended to share his life with. She said, "I would like that. When you are ready." He nodded. They stood side by side in front of his father's journals in the library of a house that was going to be hers, and neither of them said anything else, and it was enough. The trouble arrived on a Thursday in the last week of October, 11 days before the wedding. It came in the form of a man named Gerald Whitfield. Elizabeth did not know Gerald Whitfield well. She knew of him. He was a lawyer, or had been a lawyer based in Richmond, connected to several of the larger families in the area, through a web of professional associations and old debts that she had never bothered to map because he had not been relevant to her life. He was perhaps 45, perhaps older, with the kind of face that was difficult to look at directly, not because it was ugly, but because it was always arranged in an expression of such careful pleasantness that you could never quite find anything real in it. He appeared at the Whitmore house on a Thursday morning unannounced, when her father was at the counting house and her mother was visiting a neighbor. He appeared, that is, when Elizabeth was home alone, except for the household servants, which she would later understand was not coincidence. She received him in the parlor because refusing to receive a caller was its own kind of statement, and she did not yet know what kind of statement she wanted to make. He sat down without being invited and said with the particular warmth of a man performing warmth, "Miss Whitmore, I hope I find you well. I understand congratulations are in order." "They are," she said. "Thank you for the sentiment. I knew your father when he was building his business," he said. "A good man, a steady man." He paused, letting the words arrange themselves. "I also knew Nathaniel Carter's father, William Carter. A fine man. Complicated finances in his last years, but a fine man." Elizabeth looked at him. "Is there something specific I can help you with, Mr. Whitfield?" "I will be direct," he said. "I have come as a courtesy, a professional courtesy, you might say. There are certain facts about the Carter estate that have recently come to my attention, certain matters relating to the financial condition of Grayfield, that I feel any woman in your position ought to know before she makes a legal commitment." She was very still. "What matters?" William Carter, in the final 2 years of his life, made certain decisions that were not wise. There were debts, considerable ones, debts that were not fully disclosed at the time of his death. He paused, letting that land. Nathaniel has managed the situation to his credit. But managing a situation and resolving it are different things. There are parties who hold claims against the Grayfield property, claims that in certain legal circumstances could become significant. Elizabeth looked at him. She looked at him the way she looked at things she was reading carefully, not for what they said, but for what they were trying to say without saying it. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, "are you telling me that Grayfield has creditors?" "I am telling you that the situation is more complex than may have been represented to you." "And who sent you here to tell me this?" A pause, just a beat too long. "I am acting on my own initiative," he said, "as I said, a courtesy." She looked at him for one more moment. Then she said, "I appreciate your visit. I will discuss what you have told me with my father and with Mr. Carter. Good morning." He did not move immediately. He looked at her with that careful, pleasant expression, and she understood in the space of that look that whatever he was, he had not expected this. He had expected a young woman who would be frightened. He had expected uncertainty. He had expected someone who could be managed. He stood. He nodded. He left. Elizabeth sat in the parlor alone for 15 minutes and thought. Then she went to find her father. Robert Whitmore came home from the counting house at midday and listened to his daughter describe the visit with the focused expression he wore when he was cataloging information. He asked 2 questions. He asked who had been present and what exactly had been said word for word. Elizabeth told him both things precisely. Her father was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Gerald Whitfield is not a man who acts on his own initiative." "No," Elizabeth agreed. "He is not. Someone sent him." "Yes. The question is who?" Her father looked at his hands. "The debt claim, there may be truth in it. William Carter's final years were not his best years financially. I knew some of this through our business dealings." He paused. "Whether the claims are active and significant, or whether Whitfield is exaggerating for effect, that I don't know." "Nathaniel will know," Elizabeth said. "Yes, he will." "I need to speak with him," she said. "Today." Her father looked at her. "Elizabeth, if there are serious debts, if the financial situation at Grayfield is genuinely unstable, then I need to know that," she said, clearly and completely. "Not to change my mind, Papa, to understand what I am walking into so I can walk into it with open eyes." She paused. "The same way he walked into a courtship with me knowing there would be consequences. I owe him the same honesty in return." Her father studied her for a long moment. Then he sent a note to Grayfield. Nathaniel arrived within the hour. He came in with the particular quality of a man who has read an urgent note and ridden hard in response to it. And he looked at Elizabeth first before he looked at her father, which told her something she kept. She told him about Whitfield. She told him precisely the same way she had told her father. She watched his face as she spoke. His expression did not collapse. It did not become defensive or evasive. What it became was very still in the way that things become still when they are being held under significant pressure. When she finished, he said, "How much did he tell you?" "Debts from your father's final years, claims against Grayfield." He was vague about the amounts and the specifics. Nathaniel was quiet. He looked at her father. He looked at Elizabeth. He said, "I owe you the truth." "Yes," Elizabeth said. "You do." He told them. His father, in the last 2 years of his life, had made investments that did not perform as expected. He had borrowed against the Grayfield property to cover the losses, borrowing from 2 sources, a Richmond bank and a private creditor. The bank debt was known, documented, and was being serviced. The private debt was the complication. The private creditor had died 2 years after William Carter, and the ownership of that debt had passed through the creditor's estate to a party that Nathaniel had spent 3 years trying to identify, and had finally, 8 months ago, identified. The debt had been purchased, quietly, by a man named James Aldridge. Elizabeth heard the name and felt something cold move through her. James Aldridge. Thomas Aldridge's older brother, the firstborn son of the family that Caroline had married into. "He bought your father's debt," her father said slowly. "He bought it 3 years ago through an intermediary, which is why it took me so long to find him," Nathaniel said. His voice was controlled. He was holding something back, not dishonesty, but feeling the kind that he did not yet have the habit of releasing in company. "He has made no move on it. He has not called it in. He has simply held it." "Waiting," Elizabeth said. "Yes." "Waiting for what?" She looked at him directly. "Nathaniel, what does James Aldridge want from you?" A pause, long enough to mean something. 3 years ago," Nathaniel said, "before I went to your sister's wedding, before any of this, James Aldridge approached me about a land matter. There is a tract of property between Grayfield's southern boundary and land his family controls. He wanted it. He offered a price that was below value and structured the offer in a way that was designed to make refusal difficult." He paused. "I refused." "And then he bought your father's debt," Elizabeth said. "Yes." The sitting room was very quiet. Her father said very carefully, "The debt is legal. If he calls it in, you would be required to respond." "Yes," Nathaniel said. "Can Grayfield carry it?" "Not immediately, not in the form it currently exists. It would require selling assets." He paused. "Or selling the land he wants." Elizabeth was watching him. He had not looked away from her since he started speaking, and she understood that he was telling this to her specifically, not to her father, not to the room, but to her. He was doing what he had promised to do from the beginning. He was being entirely honest about a thing that was frightening and costly to be honest about. She said, "Why now? Why is Whitfield here now, 11 days before the wedding?" "Because," Nathaniel said quietly, "he knows that 11 days before a wedding is when a woman is most likely to be frightened, and because he knows that if this becomes public before the wedding, the social damage will be significant." "He is using it as leverage," she said. "Yes." "Against you, or against me?" He looked at her. "Both of us. If you withdraw from the engagement, I lose the public standing the match has given me. If I capitulate to his land demand to protect the match, he gets what he has been waiting 3 years to get." She looked at him for a long time, long enough that the room was uncomfortable with the length of it. Then she said, "Have you told anyone else about the Aldridge debt?" "My solicitor. No one else." "You have documentation, all of it." "All of it." She turned to her father. "Papa, what is the legal standing of a debt of this kind if it can be demonstrated that it was purchased with the specific intent of coercing a land sale?" Her father blinked. Then he looked at his daughter with an expression that was equal parts pride and astonishment. "It would depend on the jurisdiction and the specifics of the purchase," he said slowly. "But there is an argument to be made that a debt used as an instrument of coercion." "What solicitor do you use?" she said to her father. "William Hatch in Charlottesville." "Is he good?" "He is very good." "Then I think," Elizabeth said, "that you need to arrange a meeting before the wedding. And I think Nathaniel's solicitor needs to be present as well." She turned back to Nathaniel. "And I think you need to stop carrying this alone." Nathaniel looked at her. Something in his face shifted that thing she had seen once before in the parlor when she had told him she considered the cost worth paying that thing of a man who is not accustomed to being helped and is encountering the experience of it for the first time. He said, "Elizabeth, don't," she said. "Don't thank me, don't apologize, just tell me what else I need to know." He told her. All of it this time. Every detail of the Aldridge situation, the debt structure, the timeline, the leverage. He spoke for 20 minutes without stopping, and she listened to all of it without interrupting, taking it in the way she took in everything completely without flinching. When he finished, she said, "All right." He looked at her. "All right." "All right," she said again. "We can manage this. It is a problem with a legal dimension, a financial dimension, and a social dimension. None of those things are insurmountable." She paused. "What we cannot do is let Whitfield or Aldridge choose the terms of this." Her father said slowly, "She is right, Nathaniel." Nathaniel looked at her father, looked at Elizabeth. He said very quietly, "I should have told you sooner." "Yes," she said, "you should have, but you are telling me now. That is what matters." She held his eyes. "Don't make me say that twice." "No," he said. "You won't have to." The meeting with the solicitors took place 2 days later in her father's counting house, with the door closed and the shutters half drawn against the October cold. Elizabeth sat at the table. Her father had tried gently to suggest that the meeting was a matter between the men and the lawyers, and she had looked at him with an expression that ended that conversation before it fully began. William Hatch was a compact man of 60 with sharp eyes, and the particular posture of a person who has spent decades sitting across tables from people who wanted things they were not entitled to. He read the documentation Nathaniel's solicitor produced with the focused silence of a man who is assembling a picture from its parts, and when he looked up, he said, "This is a deliberately constructed trap." "Yes," Nathaniel said, "and Aldridge has made no formal demand." "Not yet. He is waiting for the wedding," Hatch said. "He will move after, when your assets are legally joined and the social cost of dissolution is highest." He tapped the papers with one finger. "He is not stupid." "No," Nathaniel agreed. "He isn't." "But he made errors," Elizabeth said. Both solicitors looked at her. Her father looked at her. Nathaniel looked at her. "The purchase through an intermediary," she said. "If the intermediary can be identified and deposed, and if the timing of the purchase 3 years ago, within 6 months of Nathaniel's refusal of the land offer, can be established as consecutive, there is a case to be made that the debt acquisition was an act of deliberate financial coercion rather than a legitimate business transaction." She paused. "Is that correct, Mr. Hatch?" Hatch looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating. Then he said, "That is a very accurate summary of the legal theory, Miss Whitmore. I have read some law, she said. Not formally, but I have read. I can see that. He turned back to Nathaniel. She is right. If we can establish the sequence in the intent, the debt's standing becomes questionable. That doesn't eliminate it, but it changes the conversation significantly. He paused. It also means that if Aldridge moves on the debt, we move on the coercion claim simultaneously. He would have to calculate whether winning the debt is worth the exposure of the method. He will not want that exposure, Elizabeth's father said. James Aldridge is a man who operates on his reputation. Then we make sure, Elizabeth said, that he understands we understand the full picture, before the wedding, before he has the chance to move. Hatch looked at her again. He said, Miss Whitmore, are you suggesting we contact Aldridge proactively? I am suggesting, she said, that we remove his advantage, which is that he believes we are ignorant of his intent. The moment he knows we know and can demonstrate we know, his leverage disappears. Silence in the room. Nathaniel was watching her. She could feel it, that direct and fully attending gaze, and she kept her eyes on Hatch because she needed to keep her thinking clear, and Nathaniel watching her with that expression made thinking clear somewhat more difficult than she preferred. Her father said slowly, It is a risk. Everything is a risk, Elizabeth said. Not acting is also a risk, and I would rather choose the terms of this engagement than receive them. Hatch looked at his counterpart. Nathaniel's man, a younger lawyer named Porter, who had been quiet through most of the meeting, but who now gave a small definitive nod. Hatch turned back to the table. He said, I will draft the communication. I will need 2 days. You have 2 days, Elizabeth said. Nathaniel said afterward, when the solicitors had gone, and her father had excused himself, and they were standing in the emptied room. Elizabeth. She turned to look at him. He said, I had a plan for managing this. I have had a plan for months. It was a more cautious plan, a longer plan. I know, she said. I could see the shape of it. You dismantled it in about 20 minutes. Your plan required you to keep being patient while Aldridge held something over you. She looked at him. I do not want to begin our marriage with something held over us. I want it clear. She paused. Do you trust Hatch? Yes. Then trust him to do this right. She looked at him steadily. And trust me to know what I am doing. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I trust you completely. Good, she said. Then stop looking like a man who is afraid I am going to break. Something happened in his face, that rare thing, that real smile there and gone but unmistakably present. I am not afraid you are going to break, he said. I am afraid I am going to spend the rest of my life slightly unable to keep pace with you. Good, she said again. It will keep you attentive. Hatch sent the communication on a Monday, 8 days before the wedding. It went to James Aldridge through formal legal channels, a letter that was on its surface courteous and professional, and that contained within its careful language a precise and complete demonstration of everything they knew. The purchase date. The intermediary's name, which Porter had spent 2 days locating through property records. The timeline that connected the land offer refusal to the debt acquisition. The legal theory. And a clear, unadorned statement that any action taken against the Grayfield property would be met with an immediate counter-filing on the grounds of financial coercion and abuse of debt. Elizabeth did not see the letter before it went. Hatch had written it, and it was a legal document, and it was not her place to rewrite it. But she had been the one to tell him what it needed to accomplish, and she trusted him to accomplish it. The response came in 4 days. It came not from Aldridge directly, but from his solicitor, a one-page document that was in its way a masterpiece of saying nothing while conceding everything. It acknowledged receipt of the communication. It stated that Mr. Aldridge had reviewed his financial holdings and had determined that the Carter debt did not fit his current portfolio strategy. It indicated that arrangements would be made to transfer the debt to Grayfield directly at the outstanding balance payable over 5 years with no acceleration clause. Elizabeth read it twice. She looked up. Hatch was watching her. "He folded," she said. "He folded," Hatch confirmed. "Entirely. The debt is now yours to manage on your own terms." He paused. "I have been a solicitor for 35 years, Miss Whitmore. That letter took 4 days. A man who was going to fight took considerably longer." He looked at her directly. "You read him correctly." She breathed in once. Let it out. She felt the weight lifting, not all at once, not dramatically but steadily, like something heavy being put down by degrees. "Good," she said. She did not celebrate. She went home and sat in her room and let herself feel the relief quietly, privately, the way she felt most things. She let herself feel it, and then she put it away and thought about what came next. What came next was the wedding. Nathaniel came on Wednesday, the last Wednesday before the ceremony, the last time he would call on her as her suitor rather than her husband. And he came in with an expression she had not seen before and could not immediately read. He came in quickly and said, "I know what you did." She looked at him. "You spoke with Hatch. He told me the full account of the meeting, all of it. What you argued, the legal theory, the decision to contact Aldridge proactively." He was still. "I knew what you did in the room that day. I was there. But I did not know." He stopped. "I did not know that Hatch had been uncertain about the approach and that you convinced him." She met his eyes. He was cautious. Caution was the wrong tool. "You were right." He crossed the room to her. He stood in front of her. He looked at her with an expression she now recognized fully, that thing she had first seen in a garden in June, that serious and completely attending gaze that made her feel like the only person in the room, the only person in the county, the only person anywhere who was actually real. "You saved Grayfield." "Grayfield is going to be my home," she said. "I had reasons of my own." "Elizabeth." "Nathaniel." "Let me say this," he said. She waited. "I have spent 10 years," he said, "believing that the only person I could trust to manage my life and my decisions was myself. Not because the people around me were untrustworthy, because I had never met anyone I was certain would stand where I stood and see what I saw and choose to act on it." He paused. "I have met that person now. I have met her, and I am 4 days away from marrying her. And I want you to know, I want to say clearly and directly and completely that I am aware of exactly what you are. And I am asking you for the rest of whatever comes after this to never stop being it." She felt something in her chest go very still and very full at the same time. She said, "I have no intention of stopping." He said, "Good." She said, 4 days is a very short time." "It is," he agreed. "I find I am not minding that." She looked at him. He looked at her. Between them was everything that had been built over the past months. The Wednesdays and Fridays, the parlor conversations, his father's journals on the library shelf, the solicitor's meeting, the letter that had folded James Aldridge like paper, and under all of it, beneath all of it, the wedding in June, where a man had crossed a garden for no reason, except that he had looked at a woman sitting alone and decided with great deliberateness that she was exactly who he wanted to cross a garden for. She had been invisible for 24 years. She had made her peace with it. She had carried it and managed it and told herself honestly and without self-pity that this was simply the weather. This was simply her life. And then the weather had changed. She said very quietly, "Nathaniel, do you know what you said to me the first time we spoke, at the wedding?" "I said a great many things," he said. "Which one?" "You said I had been thinking about who decided which sister was wrong." She looked at him. "Nobody ever said it like that. Nobody ever thought to ask that question." He was quiet for a moment. "I noticed that you had been told very consistently by the shape of the room that you were the wrong answer to a question nobody was asking correctly." He paused. "I thought that was a significant injustice." "It was," she said. "It was." She held his eyes. "Thank you for asking it differently." He looked at her for a long time. Then he said in the quiet voice he used only when something was real, "Thank you for answering." 4 days later, on a cool November morning, with the Virginia hills gone gold and red around them, Elizabeth Ann Whitmore married Nathaniel Carter in the church on the hill in Charlottesville, in front of 47 people, with white flowers from the garden, and no elaborate procession, and her father's hand on her arm, and her mother in the second pew doing her very best not to cry and doing it very badly. She said yes in a clear, steady voice that carried to the back of the church. She meant every syllable. The first winter at Grayfield was nothing like Elizabeth had imagined, and everything like what she had actually prepared for. She had imagined, in the abstract way one imagines a life before one is living it, that marriage would require a period of adjustment, that she and Nathaniel would spend weeks or months learning the specific rhythms of sharing a life, the morning habits, the evening silences, the small domestic negotiations that either build a household or erode one. She had imagined this, and she had prepared for it with the same methodical attention she brought to everything she prepared for. What she had not imagined was how quickly it would feel like something she had always been doing, not because there were no adjustments. There were. Nathaniel rose before dawn every morning, and she was not a woman who rose before dawn willingly. And she had to make her peace with the sound of him moving through the house in the early dark, while she was still horizontal and stubbornly unconscious. He kept his study in a state she could only describe as organized chaos, and resisted any intervention which she respected, even when she found it maddening. He had a horse he was unreasonably fond of, a gray named Alderman, who had the personality of a man who knew he was being indulged, and he spent time with that horse that another man might have spent on more obviously productive things. She observed all of this and catalogued it, and adjusted around it the way you adjust around the furniture of a house that was someone else's before it became yours, not removing anything, not rearranging, but learning the shape of each thing and how to move through the space without collision. He, for his part, discovered that she reorganized things she did not announce she was reorganizing, that she had opinions about the management of the tenant accounts that she would express fully and specifically if anyone made the mistake of asking what she thought, that she read at the dinner table when she believed he was too absorbed in his own papers to notice, which was never because he always noticed. He said one evening, looking up from his own document, "You are reading." "I am eating," she said without looking up. "You are eating and reading. They are not mutually exclusive. We are having dinner together." She looked up at him. "You have been reading that same page for 11 minutes. I timed it." He looked down at his paper. He looked up at her. He said, "You timed it." "I was curious whether you were reading or thinking." "I was thinking." "Then I was providing company while you thought," she said pleasantly, "and reading while you did so. We were both productively occupied." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked back down at his paper. After a beat, she heard him exhale very quietly, in a way that she was learning meant he was privately amused and declining to show it fully. She went back to her book. They finished dinner in companionable parallel. It was, she thought, possibly her favorite kind of evening. She wrote to Caroline in December and described none of this directly, but described enough of it that Caroline, who knew her better than anyone except perhaps their father, would understand the overall situation. Caroline wrote back, "You sound happy, Lizzie. I don't think I have ever heard you sound happy in a letter before. You have always sounded fine or well or managing. Happy is different. I am glad of it." Elizabeth read that letter 3 times. The Aldridge debt resolution held. James Aldridge made no further moves against Grayfield, and Gerald Whitfield was not heard from again, which was its own form of answer. William Hatch had drawn up the repayment arrangement with the precision of a man who intended it to be challenge-proof, and Nathaniel managed the first quarterly payment in December with the satisfaction of a person closing a chapter he had been waiting a long time to close. He said nothing dramatic about it. That was not his way. He simply came home one evening and told her it was done, and she said good, and they had dinner, and that was that. But she watched him in the days that followed, and she saw the specific quality of a man who has put down something heavy. Not the theater of relief, but the genuine physical reality of it, the way his shoulders sat differently, the way the line between his eyes was less constant than it had been. She had done that. Not alone Hatch had done it, and Porter and her father's introduction had made Hatch possible. But the shape of the solution had come from her, and she knew it, and she did not need him to say so, because he had already said it once and meant it, and that was enough. It was in this state, settled, cautiously glad, beginning to understand the particular texture of the life she was building, that the second trouble arrived. It arrived in January. The letter came from Richmond on a Tuesday morning in the second week of January 1816, addressed to Nathaniel in a hand Elizabeth did not recognize. She was in the library when he read it. She knew something was wrong before he said anything, because of the way he went still. Not the deliberate stillness he sometimes chose, but the involuntary stillness of a person absorbing something unexpected. She looked up from her book. She said nothing. She waited. He looked up from the letter. He said, "It is from Clara." She put her book down. "Clara Aldridge," he said. She was Clara Beaumont. She married a man named Henry Aldridge 3 years ago. He paused. Not James Aldridge's family. A different Aldridge from Augusta County. "What does she want?" Elizabeth said. "She wants to meet with me." He looked at the letter, then back at Elizabeth. "She says she has information about James Aldridge, about his intentions toward Grayfield." He paused. "She says she has been trying to decide whether to write for 6 months." Elizabeth was very still. She was thinking about what this meant, not the easy surface of it, which was a letter from the woman whose life was permanently tangled with her husband's past, but the deeper architecture, the question of what Clara Beaumont, now Clara Aldridge of Augusta County, could know about James Aldridge's financial maneuvers against Grayfield. "How would she know anything about Aldridge's intentions?" she said. "She doesn't say. Not in the letter." He looked at it again. "She only says that she heard about the engagement. She says she heard about the wedding actually. She says she is glad for me. She says she has carried something for 6 months, and she does not want to carry it any longer." "She heard about the Whitfield visit," Elizabeth said slowly. "Perhaps. Or she heard about the debt resolution, and she understood the shape of it." She looked at him. "Nathaniel, is there something about James Aldridge that you don't know? Something that connects him to her?" He was quiet. "Nathaniel." "Her husband," he said slowly. "Henry Aldridge, he has had dealings with James Aldridge, business dealings. They are not close, but they know each other. I did not think it relevant." He paused. "I may have been wrong about that." She stood up. She said, "Write back to her, today. Ask her to come here." He looked at her. "Elizabeth, Clara Beaumont did nothing wrong," she said clearly. "She loved the wrong person in the wrong circumstances, and she was protected by you at significant cost, and she has apparently spent 6 months deciding whether to repay that protection with information she believes is useful. I am not going to let pride or discomfort prevent me from hearing what she has to say." She met his eyes steadily. "Write to her. Ask her to come." He looked at her for a long moment. The particular quality of his gaze, the thing that still after months of marriage had the capacity to make her feel entirely seen, rested on her fully. He said, "You are a remarkable woman." "I am a practical woman," she said. "They are sometimes the same thing. Write the letter." He wrote it that afternoon. Clara Aldridge arrived at Grayfield on a Thursday morning 2 weeks later. She came in a plain carriage with one attendant and presented herself at the door with the composed demeanor of a woman who has made a decision she intends to see through. Elizabeth had formed no image of her beforehand. She had refused to form one. It seemed dishonest constructing a person in advance of meeting them, particularly in circumstances this layered. She had told herself simply that Clara was a woman who had been in an impossible situation and had been helped out of it, and that this was the entirety of what Elizabeth needed to know before the door opened. Clara was perhaps 30. She had a quiet, careful face, not beautiful in the way that commanded rooms, but arresting in the way of people who have thought a great deal and learned to hold most of it behind their eyes. She looked at Nathaniel when she came in, and something passed between them. Acknowledgement, old shared history, and the specific relief of two people who have not seen each other in years, and discover upon seeing each other that they bear no wound that was not already healed. She looked at Elizabeth next. She looked at her directly and said, "Mrs. Carter, I want to thank you for receiving me." "You have something to tell us," Elizabeth said. "I am glad you came." They went into the parlor. Nathaniel's housekeeper brought tea that nobody drank. Clara sat with her hands in her lap and collected herself for a moment and then said without preamble, "My husband did business with James Aldridge last autumn. A small matter, a supply arrangement, nothing significant. They met twice here in Virginia. The second meeting my husband came home and told me something that troubled him." She paused. "He told me that Aldridge had spoken about Nathaniel. He had not been asked to. He simply spoke. He said that Nathaniel Carter's new wife would not save him because the debt was only one instrument and that there were others." Elizabeth and Nathaniel looked at each other. "Others?" Nathaniel said. "My husband did not press him," Clara said. "He did not want to appear interested, but he remembered it and he told me because—" She stopped, looked at her hands briefly. "Because he knew the history. My history with you." She looked at Nathaniel. "He is a good man, my husband. He thought I should know, in case it was ever useful." She paused. "When I heard about the debt resolution, I thought he accepted that too easily. James Aldridge does not accept things. He redirects." The parlor was very quiet. Elizabeth said, "He folded on the debt because the debt became a liability. But if he has another instrument, then he was never primarily interested in the land," Nathaniel said. The three of them sat with that for a moment. Then Elizabeth said, "What does he actually want, if not the land?" Clara said carefully, "My husband believes this is his interpretation, not something Aldridge said directly, that there is something in the Carter family records, some document or claim, something that Aldridge believes would be valuable to him if he could access it or discredit it." The room changed. Elizabeth felt it not physically, not dramatically, but the quality of the air in the room changed the way air changes before weather arrives. "What records?" Nathaniel said. His voice was very quiet. "He didn't know," Clara said. "He said Aldridge was vague, deliberate so." Nathaniel stood up. He excused himself from the room with the precise courtesy of a man who has excellent manners and is very disturbed. Elizabeth watched him go. She turned to Clara. Clara was watching her. "He will be all right," Elizabeth said. "I know," Clara said. "He always is. That has never been the question about him." She paused. "The question has always been whether he would let someone stand with him." She looked at Elizabeth directly. "It seems he has." Elizabeth met her eyes. "He has." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want you to know what he did 7 years ago. I have wanted to say this to him for years, and I have not had the occasion. What he did was the most genuinely decent thing anyone has ever done for me. My husband knows the truth. My family does not and probably never will. But I know. And I have never been able to properly—" She stopped. "You do not owe either of us an accounting," Elizabeth said. "I know I don't." Clara looked at her steadily. "I came because the debt I carry to him is not a financial one, and I found an opportunity to pay something toward it." She paused. "I hope it helps." "It does," Elizabeth said. "Considerably." Nathaniel came back into the room 10 minutes later. He had the look of a man who has done something with a difficult feeling in a short time, which was one of the things Elizabeth had learned about him. He could not make difficult feelings disappear, but he could take them somewhere private and hold them there long enough to function. He said to Clara, "Thank you for coming." "Take care of yourself, Nathaniel," she said. Not sentimentally, simply. "I have help with that now," he said. He looked at Elizabeth when he said it. Clara left an hour later. Elizabeth stood with Nathaniel in the hall and waited until the carriage sound had faded down the road, and then she said, "The library." "Yes," he said. "Your father's journals?" "Yes." He said again more quietly, "Is there something in them?" He was silent for a moment. Then he said, "I don't know. I have not read them. I told you I was not ready." He paused. "I think I need to be ready now." She took his hand. He looked down at it, at her hand in his, and then he looked up at her. "Together," she said. He held her hand. He said, "Together." They read the journals that evening, starting from the last volume, the most recent, the one covering the final 2 years of William Carter's life, the years of the investments that had failed and the debts that had followed. Elizabeth sat beside Nathaniel at the library table, with the lamp between them, and they read in turns, passing the pages, and she kept her face still, even when she was not feeling still, because she understood that this was something sacred in the particular sense that it was about a man who was gone and a son who was still learning what his father had been. William Carter was in the pages of his journal more complicated than his reputation. He had been a man of significant capability who had, in his later years, developed a conviction not based in reality. It became clear as they read that the Carter family's position in the county was declining, that younger and more aggressive men were overtaking them, and that he needed to act boldly to prevent it. The investments were that boldness. They were also read from a decade's distance, obviously unwise. And then, in the entry dated March of 1812, Elizabeth found it. She read it twice silently before she said anything. She needed to be sure she understood what she was reading. She said, "Nathaniel." He looked up. She turned the journal so he could see the page. She pointed. He read it. She watched his face as he read. She watched him go still. His father had recorded in March of 1812 a meeting with James Aldrich. Not the James Aldrich who had purchased the debt, but his father, the elder Aldrich, now dead. The meeting had been about a boundary dispute, one that predated Nathaniel's ownership of Grayfield by years. The elder Aldrich had claimed that a portion of the southern tract of Grayfield, the exact tract his son James now wanted, had been improperly included in the Carter deed at the original survey. William Carter had disagreed. He had noted in the journal that he believed the survey was accurate, but that he had not been able to locate the original survey documents to prove it. He had noted in his careful handwriting that the documents might be in the county recorder's office in Charlottesville, filed under a different family name, because of how the original land had changed hands before the Carters acquired it. He had intended to look. He had written "must follow this up" in the margin. He had never followed it up. He had died 8 months later. Nathaniel read the entry 3 times. Then he looked up. "The survey documents," he said. "They may still be there," Elizabeth said. "In the recorder's office. If they were never retrieved, they would prove the boundary definitively." "Yes?" She held his eyes. "And they would also prove that Aldrich the son James knows this claim is false. Because his father knew this claim was false. Because his father sat across a table from your father in 1812 and was told the same thing." She paused. "James Aldrich is not pursuing a legitimate boundary question. He is pursuing his father's discredited one, hoping that the documents that discredit it have never been found." Nathaniel stood up. He walked to the window. He stood there with his back to her, and she waited, giving him the moment, understanding that this was not simple. This was his father and his father's failures, and also his father's careful notation of something important that had simply never been completed. It was the feeling of grief and gratitude arriving at the same time which was one of the more difficult emotional combinations a person could receive. She gave him 3 minutes. Then she said quietly, "Nathaniel." He turned. She said, "Your father wrote it down. He kept the record. He knew it mattered even when he couldn't follow it up." She paused. "That is not failure. That is a man who understood more than he had time to act on." Nathaniel looked at her across the library. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her for months, that full and serious attention. But now there was something else in it, something raw and grateful and not quite under control. He said, "I need to go to Charlottesville tomorrow morning." "I know," she said. "I am coming with you." "Elizabeth." "I found it," she said simply. "I am coming." He did not argue. The county recorder's office in Charlottesville occupied 2 rooms in a building on the main street that smelled of old paper and cold mornings, and the specific density of accumulated official record. The recorder was a man named Aldous Webb 70, if he was a day, who had been keeping the county's documents since before Nathaniel was born, and who greeted them with the unhurried competence of a man who understood that records outlasted everything else. Elizabeth explained what they were looking for. She had made notes the night before the approximate date range, the original family name under which the land had been held before the Carters, the general location of the tract. She laid the notes on Webb's counter, and he read them with the focused attention of a man who speaks the language of documentation as a native tongue. He went into the back room. He was gone 23 minutes. Elizabeth knew because she counted. He came back carrying a flat leather folder, the kind used for survey documents, worn at the edges and tied with a string that had not been untied in a considerable number of years. He set it on the counter. He said, "This would be what you're looking for, I believe." She untied the string herself. Her hands were steady. She was not feeling steady, but her hands were, and she opened the folder and spread the documents on the counter, and she and Nathaniel looked at them together. The survey was there. Complete, dated 1798, signed by the original surveyor and 2 witnesses. The boundary line was drawn with the precision of a man who had measured carefully and recorded exactly what he found, and the line placed the southern tract fully unambiguously within the property that would become Grayfield. There was also a letter, attached to the survey with a pin that had rusted to orange, a letter from the original landowner to the county recorder dated 1799, explaining the transfer of the property and specifically noting the boundary that had been established and the survey that confirmed it. Elizabeth read every word of both documents. She looked at Nathaniel. "It is definitive," she said. "Yes," he said. "James Aldridge cannot have seen this. If he had seen this, he would have known the claim was impossible before he started. Or he saw it and believed it had been lost," Nathaniel said slowly. "Or destroyed, or overlooked." He paused. "Our records at Grayfield do not reference this survey specifically. My father's note said he couldn't find the original documents. Aldridge may have assumed they no longer existed." "He assumed wrong," Elizabeth said. She looked at Webb, who was standing at a respectful distance, with the expression of a man who has long understood that the documents he keeps have consequences and is entirely comfortable with that fact. She said, "Mr. Webb, we need certified copies of these documents, as many as you are able to produce." "I can have them for you by tomorrow morning," he said. "This afternoon would be better," she said. He looked at her. He said, "This afternoon, then." They waited. They sat in the outer room of the recorder's office on a bench that was not comfortable and was not intended to be, and Nathaniel sat beside her and said nothing for a long time, and she let him say nothing because she understood that he was doing the thing he did with difficult feelings, taking them somewhere private, holding them at a manageable distance. After a while he said, "My father would have sorted this." "Your father did sort it," she said. "He wrote it down. He preserved the information even when he couldn't follow through. You sorted it. Tonight." She looked at him. "The 2 of you sorted it together 11 years apart." He was quiet. She said, "That is not nothing, Nathaniel." "No," he said after a moment. "It isn't." The copies were ready by 4 o'clock. They rode home in the last of the January light, and Elizabeth held the leather satchel with the certified copies in her lap, and she felt the weight of the documents inside it not heavy in itself, but heavy with what it meant, with the years it closed, and the thing it settled, with the record of a careful man and his careful son, and the woman who had gone with him to retrieve what was his. Hatch received the documents the following day and spent 1 hour reviewing them, and then sent a letter to James Aldridge's solicitor that was, in Elizabeth's estimation, when Hatch read it to her, a model of precision. It stated the facts. It attached the certified copies. It noted that the Carter family had now established through official county records the definitive boundary of the Grayfield property, and that any claim to the contrary was unsupported by the historical survey documentation and would be contested accordingly. The response when it came 5 days later was silence. Not the silence of a man planning a countermove. The silence of a man who had nothing left to say. Hatch confirmed it in a letter to Nathaniel Aldridge had withdrawn. Not formally, not with any admission of what he had been doing, but withdrawn in the way that men withdrew when they understood that the game was over and continuing would only cost them more. He would not pursue the land. He would not pursue the debt. He had, in the language of men who operated on leverage, run out of leverage. Nathaniel read Hatch's letter at the breakfast table on a Thursday morning and put it down and sat for a moment without speaking. Elizabeth watched him. He looked up. He said, "It is done." "It is done," she agreed. He said, "You found the journal entry." "You would have found it," she said, "when you were ready." "You made me ready," he said simply. She looked at him across the breakfast table. This man she had known for 8 months, this serious and careful and genuinely decent man who had spent a decade carrying things alone and had spent the past months learning incrementally that carrying things alone was a choice and not a requirement. She said, "That is what I am here for." He said, "That is not all you are here for." "No," she agreed. "It isn't, but it is part of it." She picked up her tea. "Eat your breakfast, Nathaniel. You look like a man who has not been sleeping enough." "I have not been sleeping enough," he said. "Then eat and then sleep. The crisis is resolved. You are allowed to rest." He looked at her. Something moved across his face, not the almost smile, not the rare full smile, but something quieter and more permanent than either. Something that did not need to be named because it was simply plainly there. He picked up his fork. He said, "You are going to spend the rest of our lives telling me to eat and sleep." "Someone has to," she said. "You are constitutionally opposed to both when under pressure." "I am not opposed. You ate half a meal for 4 consecutive days last week, and you were in the study past midnight on Tuesday." "I was thinking." "You can think after you have eaten and slept," she said. "The thinking will be better." He looked at her for another moment. He said, "I am deeply grateful I went to that wedding." She said, "I know." "Are you going to let me say it properly?" "You just said it properly." "Elizabeth." She set down her tea. She looked at him across the table. She let the moment be what it was, not performing it, not rushing through it, but sitting inside it the way she had learned to sit inside things that were too full to manage with ordinary speed. She said, "So am I, Nathaniel. So am I." Outside, the January cold pressed against the windows of Grayfield, and somewhere in the house the morning was going about its business, and everything that had been threatened and defended and finally secured sat quietly in its place, solid as the survey documents in the file that Hatch was keeping in his office in Charlottesville, solid as the record his father had written in the journal on the library shelf, solid as the life being built in this house by 2 people who had each in their own way spent too long sitting in corners of rooms that did not yet belong to them. That was done now. They were home. Spring came to Grayfield the way it always came to Virginia, without asking permission and all at once. One morning in late March, the ground was still hard, and the trees were still bare, and Elizabeth could see her breath in the library where she sat reading before the household fully woke. The next morning, everything had shifted. The air had a different weight to it. The birds came back to the garden and announced themselves with the particular loudness of creatures who have been away and want credit for returning. The tenant farmers appeared at the edge of the south fields before sunup, and Nathaniel was with them because he was always with them in the first week of spring planting, because his father had been, and his grandfather before that, and because it was one of the things Elizabeth had learned about him, that he believed a man who owned land owed that land his actual presence, not just his management. She watched him from the window sometimes in those early mornings. Not because she was sentimental about it, she told herself, but because she was still learning the shape of his life and the shape of hers inside it, and watching him in the field with the tenants told her things about him that the parlor and the library did not. What it told her was that he was respected. Not in the way powerful men are respected from a distance, with the cautious politeness of people who need something from you. He was respected up close in the kind of way that required being known. The Tennant families had worked Carter land for 2 and 3 generations. They knew what William Carter had been good years, and difficult ones both, and they knew what Nathaniel had become in the decades since his father died, and the way they spoke to him directly without excessive deference, expecting to be heard, was its own form of testimony. She had been watching, and she had been thinking, and what she was thinking about was a woman named Ruth Holloway. Ruth Holloway was the wife of Daniel Holloway, who farmed the eastern portion of Grayfield's Tennant land. She was perhaps 50, with the capable hands and the steady manner of a woman who had been managing difficult circumstances for most of her adult life. Elizabeth had met her twice, once in November, just after the wedding, when she had made a point of meeting all the Tennant families, and once in February, when Ruth had come to the house on an errand. Both times Elizabeth had noticed things. Ruth Holloway was not well. Not dramatically, not in a way she mentioned or displayed, but in the particular way that women of her era did not mention or display illness, because there was too much work to be done, and too few people to do it if they stopped. She moved with the careful deliberateness of someone managing pain. She tired earlier than the work required her to tire. She ate when Elizabeth had occasion to observe it, with the diminished appetite of someone for whom eating had become an obligation rather than a pleasure. Daniel Holloway had not said anything to Nathaniel. Elizabeth was fairly certain about this. Men of that community in that time did not generally bring their wives' health into discussions with their landlord. It was not the way things were done, and even if it had been, Daniel Holloway was a proud man, and pride has its own particular silence. She brought it up one evening in early April. She and Nathaniel were in the library after dinner, reading, he going through accounts, both of them occupying the same comfortable parallel she had described to Caroline months ago. She put her book down and said, "Ruth Holloway." He looked up. "What about her?" "She is not well." He set his pen down. He gave her his full attention immediately without requiring an explanation of why this was relevant to him. That was one of the things about him. He understood that when she raised a thing, the thing was worth raising. "How do you know?" he said. "I have been watching her for 4 months," Elizabeth said. "I do not know the specific nature of it, but she is managing pain, and she is tired in a way that is not the tiredness of hard work." She paused. "Daniel has not told you?" "No. He won't." "No." He agreed. "Someone needs to speak to her," Elizabeth said. "Not about charity. Not in a way that requires her to accept help, as if it is something owed to them, in a way that is simply human." She looked at him. "I would like to visit her, properly, with a purpose that gives her something to do, rather than something to receive." He looked at her for a moment. "What purpose?" "I want to learn how she manages the kitchen garden," Elizabeth said. "I want to ask her to teach me. Grayfield's kitchen garden has been maintained without a particular system since your housekeeper retired last autumn, and I am genuinely ignorant of how to correct that. And Ruth Holloway's kitchen garden is the best managed piece of earth on this property. I have seen it." She paused. "I want her knowledge. I can offer her engagement and company, and the particular dignity of being the one who knows more." She met his eyes. "And I can arrange in the course of that engagement for the household to provide certain things, meals, medicines, assistance, in a way that is reciprocal rather than charitable." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You have thought about this carefully." "I think about everything carefully," she said. "I know." Something moved across his face. "Go tomorrow if you like. Tell her I sent you to learn the garden." "I am not going because you sent me," she said. "I know that too," he said. "But it will be easier for Daniel if he believes I asked." She considered that. It was, she acknowledged, accurate. "Fine," she said. "Tell Daniel you asked." She went the next morning. Ruth Holloway received her in the kitchen of the Holloway house with the contained surprise of a woman who had not expected to be visited by the mistress of Grayfield and was rapidly reorganizing her understanding of the situation. Elizabeth sat at the kitchen table and said she had heard the Holloway garden was the finest on the property, and that she was in ignorance of how to manage one properly, and that she would be grateful for instruction. What followed was an hour and a half that Elizabeth would later describe to Nathaniel as one of the most genuinely educational mornings she had spent since their time in the recorder's office, except that instead of survey documents, she was learning about soil composition and the timing of seed planting and the specific management of herbs in Virginia clay. Ruth Holloway was a woman of considerable practical intelligence who had never in her life had anyone ask her to share it formally. She opened like a window when the right question was put to her. She talked for an hour and a half without stopping, and Elizabeth took notes, and the notes were genuine because the information was genuinely useful, and Elizabeth did not perform interest she did not feel. At the end of it, Elizabeth arranged without stating the arrangement for the Grayfield household to begin sending a weekly basket to the Holloway family as reciprocal exchange for the ongoing garden instruction. She arranged also for Dr. Harmon from Charlottesville to visit the tenant families as part of a general spring health check that she told Nathaniel he should implement across the whole property, which was true, and which he had been meaning to do for 2 years and had not gotten to. He got to it in April. Ruth Holloway was diagnosed with a chronic condition of the joints that was not curable, but was manageable with the right treatment, which she now received. When Elizabeth visited the following month, Ruth's hands moved with slightly less deliberateness than they had. It was not dramatic. It was not a transformation. It was a woman in slightly less pain going about her life with slightly more ease. Ruth said on that second visit without looking up from the seedlings she was transplanting. "You didn't come for the garden." Elizabeth said, "I came for the garden and for you." Both things were true. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You are different from what I expected." "What did you expect?" Elizabeth said. "A fine lady who would want things managed properly and wouldn't much concern herself with who was managing them." "I concern myself with people," Elizabeth said. "I always have. I simply was not always in a position to act on it." Ruth looked at her directly for the first time. She said, "He married well." Elizabeth said, "I believe we both did." The county's opinion of Nathaniel Carter had been shifting since the previous summer. But the shift was slow and uneven, the way social opinion always shifts not in a clean line, but in a series of adjustments. Some people moving faster than others, some requiring more evidence than others. The evidence arrived in May. It came from an unexpected direction. It came from Caroline. Caroline wrote a letter in the second week of May that was longer than her usual letters and contained in its middle section a piece of information that Elizabeth read 3 times before she fully understood its significance. Caroline had been at a Richmond social gathering the previous week, and at that gathering she had encountered a woman named Mrs. Henrietta Beaumont, Clara's mother. The elder Mrs. Beaumont. The woman who, by the story as generally understood, had every reason to be the bitterest of Nathaniel Carter's accusers, according to Caroline. Mrs. Beaumont had said in a context that appeared to be unprompted, "I understand Nathaniel Carter has married. I am glad for him. He was never the man he was made out to be, and I have long known it, though it was not my place to say so." Caroline had written Lizzie. "I do not know what that means exactly, but I thought you would want to know," she said it. Elizabeth read the letter at the breakfast table. She set it down. She looked at Nathaniel, who was on his second cup of coffee and reading something about crop rotation that he had been reading at intervals for 3 weeks. She said, "Nathaniel." He looked up. She handed him the letter and watched him read it. She watched his face with the careful attention she had been giving his face for almost a year now, and she saw what happened in it when he reached the relevant passage, that particular stillness, and then something releasing very slowly like a knot that has been tied for so long. The rope has taken the shape of it. He set the letter down. He did not say anything for a moment. She said quietly, "She knew." "She must have asked Clara," he said. "At some point. Clara must have told her." "Or Clara's happiness told her," Elizabeth said. "Some mothers know their children well enough that they do not need to be told directly." He was quiet. He looked at the table. He looked at the letter. He looked at his hands. She said, "7 years, Nathaniel." Yes, he said. It is done now. It is done. He looked up at her. His eyes held something she did not see often, not because he did not feel things deeply, but because he had spent so many years keeping deep feeling at a private distance. He said, I did not realize how much I was still carrying it. I know, she said. I have been watching you carry it. You never said. I was waiting for you to be ready to put it down. She looked at him steadily. Are you ready? He breathed in, let it out, said, yes. Good, she said. She picked up her own letter and her tea. She said, then put it down and eat your breakfast. You have a meeting with the Southfield tenants at 9 o'clock. He looked at her. That rare, full thing, the real smile, not the almost, not the suggestion, but the actual crossed his face and stayed there for longer than it usually did. He said, you are the most relentlessly practical person I have ever met. Yes, she agreed. That is why you married me. That is one reason, he said. Eat, she said. He ate. The county social season resumed in June, as it always did, with the particular intensity of a community that has spent the winter in relative isolation and emerges into summer with accumulated social energy and an appetite for events. There were dinners and gatherings, and the kind of informal assemblies that were not formally organized but happened because enough people decided simultaneously that it was time. Elizabeth attended these things as she had always attended them, with attention and without illusion. But attending them as Elizabeth Carter was different from attending them as Elizabeth Whitmore, and not only because of the name or the position. It was different because she was not sitting in corners anymore. Not because corners were no longer available, but because she had stopped requiring the corner's protection. She noticed this about herself gradually, the way you notice things that change so slowly they are invisible while changing. One evening at a dinner at the Hartfield estate, the family who lived 6 miles north and hosted the most formal gatherings in the county, she found herself in the middle of a conversation with 4 other women talking about the management of large properties and the specific challenges of the spring planting season, and she was not performing the conversation or managing her position within it. She was simply in it, contributing directly and being heard directly and then listening directly to what the others said. Helen Hartfield, the eldest daughter of the house, said to her afterward quietly in the hall, "You have changed, Mrs. Carter." Elizabeth considered that. "Have I?" "You used to be very still," Helen said. "Very watchful. You were always present, but you were never quite in. Do you know what I mean?" "I know exactly what you mean," Elizabeth said. "Now you are in," Helen said, simply, accurately. Elizabeth thought about that on the ride home with Nathaniel beside her in the carriage, asking what she was thinking, because he had learned that when she was quiet for more than 10 minutes, she was thinking about something specific. She said, "Helen Hartfield told me I have changed." "You have," he said. She looked at him. "You could have disagreed." "I try not to say things that aren't true," he said. "How have I changed?" she said. "According to you." He was quiet for a moment, giving it the actual thought it deserved, rather than reaching for a flattering quick answer. She appreciated that. She had always appreciated that. He said, "When I met you, you were the most self-contained person I had ever sat across from. You held everything inside a very tight boundary. Not because you were cold. I understood immediately you were not cold, but because you had learned that the boundary was necessary, that without it things got taken from you." He paused. "The boundary is still there, but it is not as structural as it was. You hold it differently. You can put it down when you choose to, rather than maintaining it, because you are afraid of what happens if you don't." She sat with that for a moment. The carriage moved through the June dark, and the road was rough in places, and smooth in others, and outside the stars were doing what they always did, indifferent to human arrangements. She said, "You saw all of that at the wedding." "Not all of it," he said. "The outline of it. The rest I have been learning." She said, "What did you see at the wedding, specifically?" "A woman," he said, "who was the most awake person in a room full of sleeping people. a woman who was watching everything with complete clarity, and had made the decision, which was a rational decision, given her circumstances, that none of it was for her. He paused. And I thought that is wrong. Whatever has taught her that it is wrong. And I wanted to say so. He looked at her in the dark of the carriage. I was not sure I had the right to say so, but I went over anyway. She said, I am glad you did. He said, I know. She looked out the carriage window at the dark Virginia countryside going past. She thought about June of the previous year, about the dogwood tree and the untouched lemonade, and the party arranged around her sister like the whole world had organized itself around something bright, and she was the shadow beside it. She thought about Nathaniel Carter crossing a garden. She said, I used to think that being overlooked was simply my nature, the way some people are cold by nature or restless by nature. I thought it was mine. She paused. I understand now that it was a thing done to me, not a thing I was. And I understand the difference because I have spent a year being seen by someone who was quite deliberate about it. She looked at him. You were deliberate about it. Yes, he said. I was. Why? She said. You have said pieces of it. I want the whole of it. He was quiet for a moment. The carriage hit a rough patch and steadied again. Then he said, because I have spent 10 years being misread, being seen as the man the story said I was, rather than the man I actually was. And I know what that costs. I know what it costs to be reduced to a version of yourself that other people find easier to manage. He paused. I recognized it in you immediately. Not the same situation, different circumstances, different kind of erasure, but the same fundamental experience of being assigned a role that had nothing to do with who you actually were. He looked at her. I thought you deserved to be seen accurately. Before I knew anything else about you, I thought that. She did not trust her voice for a moment. She looked at the window and breathed once, and then looked back at him. She said, Nathaniel. Yes. That is the most you have ever said at one time about something that was not property management or legal documentation. He looked at her. That expression, the complicated one, the real one, the one that was not for public consumption. He said, you asked. I will remember to ask more often, she said. He reached across in the dark carriage and took her hand. Just that, just her hand in his, solid and warm and certain. She held it. They rode the rest of the way home in the particular silence that has nothing missing from it. The twist arrived in July, the way the worst things arrive quietly through a door that had appeared to be closed. A letter came for Elizabeth. Not for Nathaniel, for Elizabeth addressed in a hand she did not recognize, postmarked from Augusta County. She opened it at the writing table in the library and read it and felt the cold move through her before she understood fully what she was reading. The letter was from Henry Aldridge, Clara's husband. He wrote formally and briefly. He wrote that he was sorry to trouble her, that he had not known whether to write, that he had consulted Clara before writing, and Clara had said the decision was his. He wrote that something had occurred in the past month that he believed the Carters needed to know. James Aldridge had not in fact retreated. He had redirected. Henry Aldridge had learned through a conversation he had not been intended to overhear at a business meeting in Richmond in June that James Aldridge was pursuing a different approach. Not to the land, not to the debt. He was building a case through carefully placed accounts to specific people in the county that the boundary survey documents Elizabeth had retrieved from the recorder's office were not authentic, that they had been found with suspicious convenience, that a woman known for her intelligence and her ambition had perhaps known exactly how to locate a document that could be made to appear to say what her husband needed it to say. He was not accusing her of forgery directly. He was not doing anything so actionable as that. He was simply asking questions in the particular spaces where questions spread. Was it not interesting that the documents had never been found before? Was it not remarkable that a new wife who had studied law informally, as was said, but still had located in one visit what a decade of ownership had not uncovered? Was it not worth considering? Elizabeth put the letter down. She sat for a moment in the silence of the library, with the July heat outside and the cool of the old room around her, and she felt a specific kind of anger, not the hot, reactive anger of surprise. The cold, clear anger of someone who has been careful and thorough and right, and is being accused of exactly those things as if they were evidence of wrongdoing. She picked up the letter and went to find Nathaniel. He was in the south field. She went to him there, which she did not usually do, and when he saw her face, he came to her immediately. She handed him the letter without speaking. He read it. He looked up. His expression was the one she had learned to read as the controlled surface of something considerably hotter underneath. He said, "He is attacking you. He is attacking the documents through me," she said, "which is more useful to him because I am easier to discredit than a county recorder's archive." She paused. "He is not stupid." "No," Nathaniel said. His voice was very even in the way his voice was very even when he was angrier than the voice was showing. "He is not stupid. The question," she said, "is what we do about it." She had already been thinking about it since she read the letter. She had been thinking about it for the 20 minutes it took to find Nathaniel and the 2 minutes it took him to read the letter. And they were now standing in the south field in the July heat, and she had a plan that was either correct or it was not. She said, "We do not defend the documents. Defending them requires us to argue with his version, which means his version gets equal space in the conversation." She looked at Nathaniel. "We prove the documents through him." He looked at her. "Explain." "The survey was conducted in 1798, she said. "The surveyor is dead, but surveyors have apprentices, and apprentices become surveyors, and sometimes keep records of the work they assisted on, because that work is their professional credential." She paused. "I want to find whoever apprenticed under the man who conducted that survey. If they kept records, field notes, measurements, any documentation from the 1798 work, then the survey can be corroborated not just from the county archive, but from an independent professional source. That is not findable. That is not convenient. That is verifiable." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "How do we find them?" "Hatch will know," she said. "Surveyors in this region in 1798, it is a small professional community. Hatch will know who trained under whom." She paused. "And I want Aldous Webb from the recorder's office to provide a sworn statement about the condition of the documents when they were found. The string, the rust on the pin, the age of the folder. Things that cannot be manufactured." She looked at him directly. "We build a case that is so thoroughly corroborated that the question he is asking becomes unanswerable in his favor. We do not silence him. We make him irrelevant." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. She could see him thinking, not doubting, not questioning, but following the logic to its ends and checking the structure of it. He said, "You had this ready before you found me." "I had most of it," she said. "The field notes idea came to me while I was walking here." He said, "Elizabeth, we need to move quickly," she said. "He is doing this quietly because quiet is more damaging. We need to move before the questions have time to solidify into conclusions." "I know," he said. "I mean, you are right, all of it. I just—" He stopped. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen before, something beyond the attending gaze, something that was almost helpless in its fullness. "I do not know what I did to deserve you," he said. "I have thought about it many times. I genuinely do not know." She looked at him. "You crossed a garden," she said simply. "That is what you did. You made a choice when it cost you nothing to walk the other direction. That is the entire accounting." She paused. "Now write to Hatch. Today." He wrote to Hatch that afternoon. What followed was 3 weeks of quiet, thorough work that Elizabeth would later think of as the most satisfying 3 weeks of her life, in the specific sense that the satisfaction was the satisfaction of a problem being solved correctly. Hatch found the surveyor's apprentice within 4 days. A man named Gideon Morse, now in his 50s, practicing surveyor in Fredericksburg, who had apprenticed under the original surveyor in the 1790s, and who had, with the meticulous habit of a man who had been trained, well-kept field notes from every job he had assisted on stored in an oilskin case in his office. He had the 1798 notes. They matched the county archive survey to the degree that they constituted independent professional corroboration of every measurement and every boundary line. Gideon Morse agreed without hesitation, and with the particular satisfaction of a man being asked to defend careful work to provide a sworn statement. Aldous Webb provided his own statement about the condition of the documents, the exact rust pattern on the pin, the age and wear of the leather folder, the filing location that had remained undisturbed for 17 years. He wrote it with the precise language of a man who had spent 40 years testifying to what records showed and what they did not. Hatch assembled the package. He did not send it to James Aldridge. He sent it to 3 people, the county magistrate, the president of the local merchants' association, and the rector of the Charlottesville church. 3 people who were not aligned with either the Carters or the Aldridges. 3 people who would read it and understand it, and whom others would ask when the question eventually surfaced, as questions in small counties always eventually surfaced. He sent it with a letter that explained clearly and without drama that the Carter family had become aware of questions being raised about the authenticity of certain historical documents, and that they wished to ensure the correct information was available to those in positions of community trust. It was not a legal action. It was something more effective than a legal action. It was the truth placed precisely and irrefutably in the hands of the people most likely to be asked about it. James Aldridge's questions stopped within 2 weeks, not because he was compelled to stop, because the questions had nowhere left to go. Every person he might have asked with any credibility had already received the answer before the question arrived. The county moved on to other things as counties do. Why? In August, a year after the wedding, where everything began, Elizabeth received a letter from Margaret Beaumont. Not from the elder Mrs. Beaumont, that message had come through Caroline. From Margaret herself, Clara's younger sister, the one who had written the long and careful letter the previous September, the one Elizabeth had answered with a seed planted in difficult soil. The letter was short. It said, "Mrs. Carter, I have learned certain things this past year that have changed my understanding of the situation I wrote to you about. I was wrong about your husband. I was wrong about what happened 7 years ago. I do not know how to correct what I did with what I believed, but I wanted you to know that I know it was wrong. I am sorry for the difficulty I caused. Monsieur Beaumont." Elizabeth read it. She sat with it. Then she went to the library where Nathaniel was reading. It was evening, the summer evening, long and warm through the windows, the first of the fireflies beginning outside, and she handed him the letter. He read it. He was quiet for a long time. She said nothing. She sat in the chair across from him and waited. He said finally, "The seed you planted." "Yes," she said. "It grew." He looked at the letter again. He set it down on the table beside his book. He looked at her. He said, "Are you going to write back?" "Yes," she said. "I am going to tell her that I appreciate her honesty and that the matter is closed." She paused. "Because it is. It has been for a while. I just wanted her to have the chance to close her own part of it." He looked at her with that expression, the full one, the real one, the one that had been growing more available over the course of a year, the one she had watched emerge from behind 10 years of careful distance, the way something grows when it finally has the right conditions. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the summer evening went on around them, indifferent and beautiful, the way Virginia summers were. He said, "There is something I want to say." "Say it," she said. "I told you in September before I asked you to marry me. I told you that I had been very careful for 10 years, and that with you, I found the carefulness exhausting." He paused. "I want you to know that it is gone. That specific exhaustion. I do not carry it anymore." He looked at her directly. "I thought you should know." She felt something move through her chest, warm and certain, and without complication. She said, "I know. I have been watching." He said, "I know you have." She said, "Nathaniel." "Yes." "Do you remember what you said to me at your sister's wedding? The thing that started everything?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Everyone in this room is performing something. You are the only person who is simply sitting." "I was not simply sitting," she said. "I was hiding. There is a difference." "I know that now," he said. "I knew it then too. I simply thought that if I put it the other way, it might feel less like an accusation." She looked at him. "You were right," he said. "I usually am. A beat. About certain things." She said, "You were right about this." She looked at him across the library table, across the summer evening, across the year that had contained a wedding and a garden and a solicitor's office and a recorder's archive and a threat dissolved and a name cleared and a woman learning slowly and thoroughly that she was not invisible. She had simply been waiting for someone with the sense to look. "You were right to cross that garden," she said. "I want you to know that I know it. Completely. Without reservation." She held his eyes. "You chose correctly. And so did I." He said yes. "And Grayfield is ours," she said. "Not yours that I am living in. Ours. The library, and the fields, and the kitchen garden, and the journals on the shelf, and all of it. I want you to know I feel that." "I know you do," he said. "I watch you walk through this house. I can tell." She said, "What can you tell?" He said, "That you are home." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the corner at her sister's wedding. She thought about the untouched glass of lemonade. She thought about the specific quality of being 24 years old, and certain in the quiet and reasonable way she was certain about most things that she was not the kind of person things happened to. That she was the furniture of other people's stories. Present, unnoticed, useful in a modest way. She thought about the man who had looked at her across a party and made a decision. She said, "Yes, I am." She picked up her book. He picked up his. The fireflies were fully started outside, blinking in the summer dark with the cheerful indifference of things that exist only to be themselves. The library was warm and quiet, and full of books that were no longer inherited decor, but a collection belonging to two people who read them and argued about them and read them again. Elizabeth Whitmore Carter was home. Not because the house was grand, not because the position was right, not because the match was suitable, not because anyone had decided she deserved it. She was home because she had looked at a man who was honest about what he was and decided that honesty was worth more than safety. Because she had stood at a legal table and argued a position that was correct. Because she had gone to a recorder's office and retrieved what belonged to them. Because she had planted a seed in difficult soil and waited without certainty to see if it would grow. Because she had been from the beginning exactly who she was, watchful and thorough and practical and capable of a love that was not a feeling waiting to be acted upon, but a decision made with full information and renewed every day. She had been that person in the corner at the wedding. She had been that person under the dogwood tree. She had simply been waiting in the particular patience of people who do not require approval to maintain their own character for the circumstances that would let her become fully herself. She was fully herself now, in this house, in this marriage, in this life that was entirely, unarguably, irreversibly hers. And that was not a small thing. It was not a modest thing. It was not furniture in someone else's story. It was everything. It had always been everything. It had simply taken a man with the sense to cross a room to show her where it was waiting.